Tonight we are going to slow the game down and talk through what actually works in live 1-3 poker games. This is not about flashy moves or complicated strategy. It is about understanding the environment, avoiding common mistakes, and letting patience do most of the work. You do not need to remember everything. Just listen, relax, and let the ideas settle naturally. Chapter 1. Why 1-3 is beatable if you make fewer mistakes. Many players at the $1, $3 tables find themselves losing not because of rare unlucky situations, but because of small repeatable errors that add up over time. The most common way money is lost at these stakes is through decisions that are made too loosely, too often, or without enough thought about the situation. It is not the dramatic hands with big bluffs or huge coolers that drain stacks. Instead, it is the steady drip of chips from calling too wide before the flop, chasing draws that do not have the right price, and holding on to hands that are simply not strong enough to continue. These mistakes are not always obvious in the moment, but they become clear when you look back at a session and see the same patterns repeating. For example, a player might call a raise from early position with a weak-suited connector, hoping to hit a lucky flop. Over hundreds of hands, these calls rarely pay off, and the small losses accumulate. Another frequent error is calling down with a weak pair, hoping the opponent is bluffing, when in reality, the opponent's range is full of stronger hands. These are not just isolated incidents. They are habits that, if left unchecked, quietly erode a bankroll. The key is to recognize that folding in marginal spots, especially when out of position or facing strength, is not a sign of weakness, but a way to preserve chips for better opportunities. By focusing on the decision-making process, rather than just the outcome of any single hand, you can start to identify where these leaks occur. Over time, avoiding these repeatable mistakes is what separates those who struggle from those who steadily improve. The path to steady success at $1, $3 is not paved with flashy moves or clever bluffs, but with the discipline to avoid the biggest leaks in your game. Many players believe that outplaying their opponents with tricky plays is the secret to winning, but the truth is that most profit comes from simply not making the same costly errors as everyone else. One of the most expensive leaks is calling down with second pair or a weak top pair, especially when facing multiple bets on later streets. These hands often look tempting, but when an opponent continues to show strength, it is usually a sign that your hand is no longer good. Folding in these spots may feel passive, but it saves money that would otherwise be lost to stronger holdings. Another common leak is betting for thin value on the river, with a hand that is unlikely to be called by worse. For example, checking behind with a marginal hand on the river can prevent losing extra chips to a better hand or a bluff raise. The upside of making a thin value bet is often much smaller than the downside of being called or raised by a stronger hand. Similarly, overvaluing hands like overpairs on dry boards can lead to unnecessary calls when the opponent's bet sizing or line suggests real strength. In these moments, a simple check or fold is far more effective than trying to force a win. The discipline to make these decisions, even when they feel cautious, is what keeps your stack intact and allows you to capitalize when the right spots come along. Patience and consistency are the quiet engines of winning play at the $1, $3 tables. It is easy to feel restless, especially after folding for several orbits. But the reality is that most opponents at these stakes make enough mistakes on their own to provide steady profit for those who wait. The most successful players are not those who chase every opportunity, but those who wait for strong, clear spots and avoid marginal decisions. This approach is not about being passive, but about being selective and letting the game come to you. When you focus on the process, making good decisions, hand after hand, rather than the outcome of any single pot, you build a foundation that is resilient to the swings of luck. For example, waiting for a strong hand in position and playing it straightforwardly often leads to simple, profitable decisions. There is no need to force action or manufacture big pots when the mistakes of others will create opportunities for you. Consistency in your approach, especially under uncertainty, is what allows you to take advantage of structural edges in the game. By acting only when you have a clear advantage, you avoid the traps that catch impatient players and steadily accumulate chips over time. Chapter 2. Most players lose before the flop. Entering a pot with a hand that is often outmatched by stronger holdings can set up a chain of difficult decisions and costly mistakes. When players at the $1, $2, or $1, $3 tables choose to play too many starting hands, especially from early or middle positions, they often find themselves in situations where their cards are simply not strong enough to compete profitably. Many hands that look appealing at first glance, such as King-Jack offsuit or King-Queen offsuit, are actually at a significant disadvantage against the types of hands that opponents are likely to play from early position. These hands are frequently dominated, meaning that when they make a pair, they are often up against a higher pair or a better kicker. This domination risk leads to losing more money over time, especially when calling raises from players who are only entering the pot with premium holdings. The more hands a player chooses to play, the more often they will be forced to navigate post-flop situations with a weak or marginal hand, often out of position and against stronger ranges. This pattern repeats itself throughout a session, quietly draining chips and making it difficult to build a winning record. A clear example of this problem can be seen in a hand where the stacks are 100 big blinds deep. The player under the gun, who is known to play a tight and value-heavy range, raises to $12. This range typically includes strong hands like Ace-King offsuit, Ace-Queen offsuit, Ace-Queen suited, King-Queen suited, and pocket pairs of jacks or better. The action folds to a player in middle position, who looks down at King of clubs and Jack of spades. Without much thought, the player decides to call the raise. The rest of the table folds, and the blinds also fold, leaving just two players in the pot. The pot now stands at $29. On the flop, the dealer spreads the ace of diamonds, 7 of spades, and 4 of clubs. The under-the-gun player continues with a bet of $15. The player in middle position, holding King-Jack offsuit, chooses to call again. At this point, the player has no pair and no meaningful draw, only 2 overcards that are unlikely to improve against the tight opening range. The pot grows to $59. The turn brings the 2 of hearts. The under-the-gun player bets $30. Now the player in middle position finally decides to fold, realizing that there is little chance of winning the hand. By this point, however, the player has already invested $43 with a hand that was never likely to be ahead. The mistake began before the flop, when King-Jack offsuit was called against a strong range from early position. Folding this hand pre-flop would have avoided the entire difficult and expensive situation. The turn fold is correct, but the real damage was done by entering the pot with a hand that was dominated from the start. Many players at these stakes develop habits that quietly erode their results over time. One of the most common is limping into the pot, simply calling the big blind rather than raising or folding. Limping fails to build the pot when holding a playable hand, and it also gives up the chance to take control of the action. When several players limp, the pot often goes multiway, and weak hands struggle even more to realize their equity. Another frequent habit is cold calling raises without a clear plan for how to proceed after the flop. This often happens with speculative or medium-strength hands, especially from out of position. Calling a raise with a hand like King-Jack offsuit, as in the earlier example, commits chips to a situation where the hand rarely improves to something strong enough to continue. Without the initiative, and facing a player who is representing a tight range, these calls become long-term losing plays. Open limping, or entering the pot for the minimum without raising, also invites more players into the hand, making it even harder for weak or marginal hands to win. Over time, these habits add up, leading to negative expected value and making it difficult to build a profitable session. It is important to recognize that folding before the flop is not a sign of weakness or missed opportunity. In fact, disciplined pre-flop folding is one of the most profitable and underappreciated skills at the $1, $3 tables. By folding hands like King-Jack suited or King-Jack offsuit to a raise from a tight early position player, a player avoids the risk of domination and the difficult decisions that follow. Folding pre-flop keeps the stack intact for better opportunities, where position and stronger holdings can be leveraged for greater profit. It also simplifies the game, reducing the number of marginal spots and helping to avoid the temptation to chase with weak pairs or draws. Over time, players who are selective about the hands they play before the flop see a clear improvement in their results. They lose less in marginal situations, preserve their chips for more favorable spots, and find themselves facing fewer tough decisions out of position. The win rates of players who voluntarily put money in the pot with discipline are consistently higher than those who play too many hands. Folding pre-flop is not just about avoiding losses, it is about setting up the entire hand for success by starting with a strong foundation. The lesson is simple but powerful. Most of the money lost at these stakes happens before the flop, when players choose to enter pots with hands that are not strong enough to compete against the ranges they are facing. By playing fewer hands, especially from early and middle positions, and by folding marginal holdings to raises from tight players, a player can avoid many of the most costly situations in low-stakes cash games. This approach may feel cautious at first, but it is grounded in the reality of how hands play out at these tables. The discipline to fold before the flop is a skill that pays off quietly, hand after hand, session after session. It is the foundation of a solid, winning approach to Live No Limit Hold'em. As you drift off, remember that every chip saved by folding a weak hand is a chip that can be used in a better spot. The patience to wait for those spots is what separates the steady winner from the player who struggles to get ahead. Let the lesson settle in. Folding before the flop is not just safe, it is smart, and it is one of the most reliable ways to build a lasting edge in the game. Chapter 3. Tight is not weak at 1. 3. Playing fewer hands with discipline and patience leads to stronger results in live $1, $3 no-limit hold'em. Many players at these stakes misunderstand selective play, often seeing it as a sign of hesitation or lack of confidence. This is a common misconception at the table. When someone enters the pot only with strong hands, others may assume that person is unwilling to take risks, or is simply waiting for the perfect cards. In reality, choosing to play only the best starting hands is a sign of control and confidence. It is not about being afraid to lose, but about understanding which situations are most profitable. In live games, especially at these stakes, many players are eager to see flops and get involved with marginal hands. They often believe that the more hands they play, the more chances they have to win. When they see someone folding often, they may think that player is missing out or is too timid. However, the truth is that by being selective, you are avoiding the traps that catch so many others. You are not giving away chips with weak holdings. Instead, you are waiting for the right spots, and this patience is often mistaken for weakness. It is common to hear comments at the table about someone being too tight or not willing to gamble. These remarks usually come from players who do not recognize the value of discipline. They see fewer aggressive actions and assume that means a player is not capable of putting in big bets or making strong moves. But the real strength comes from knowing when to get involved and when to let go. In live low-stakes games, aggression frequency is often misread. Because tight players are not constantly raising or betting, others may think they are easy to push around. Yet, when a tight player does enter a pot, their range is much stronger than average. This is not passivity. It is a calculated approach that protects your stack and sets you up for success over the long run. When you play a disciplined style, you will notice that opponents are less likely to put you to difficult decisions. This is because tight players are respected at the table, especially in live $1, $3 games. Opponents know that you are not entering pots with weak hands, so they hesitate to bluff or apply pressure. The fewer hands you play, the stronger your perceived range becomes. This means that when you do bet or raise, your opponents are more likely to fold. They do not want to risk chips against someone who only plays strong cards. This effect is especially noticeable after the flop. When you make a continuation bet on a dry board, players who have seen you fold many hands will often give you credit for having a strong holding. They fold their weaker hands, and you win the pot, uncontested. This is not just theory, it happens regularly in live games. The fold equity you generate by being tight is real and valuable. Opponents are reluctant to challenge you, especially when you raise from early position. They know that you are unlikely to be bluffing, so they fold hands that they might otherwise call with against a looser player. This reduces the number of tough spots you face and allows you to control the pace of the game. You do not have to worry about constant bluffs or tricky plays from others. Instead, you can focus on making solid decisions with strong hands. Over time, this approach leads to fewer big losses and more steady wins. Discipline and patience are not just about avoiding trouble, they also create opportunities for bigger wins. By building a reputation for playing only strong hands, you set yourself up for profitable situations later in the session. When you do get involved, your bets and raises are respected. This means that when you have a strong hand, you are more likely to get paid off by players who believe you always have it. Your selective approach also keeps you out of difficult multiway pots, where it is easy to make costly mistakes. Instead, you find yourself in heads-up situations with a clear advantage. The stack sizes in live $1, $3 games are often deep enough to allow for effective post-flop play. When you have the discipline to wait for premium hands, you can use your stack to apply pressure at the right moments. This is how you turn patience into profit. The opportunities do not always come quickly, but when they do, you are ready to capitalize. Let's look at a hand that demonstrates the power of disciplined, tight play in a live $1, $3 game. The stacks are 120 big blinds deep, which is a comfortable amount for post-flop decisions. You are sitting in early position, just after the under-the-gun seat. The action begins with you holding the ace of spades and king of spades, a premium suited hand. You raise to $12, showing strength from an early position. The table folds around to a player in middle position, who calls your raise. All other players fold, and you go to the flop, heads up with a pot of $27. The flop comes 9 of clubs, 4 of diamonds, and 2 of spades. This is a dry board, with few draws available. You make a continuation bet of $18. Your opponent thinks for a moment, and then folds. You win the pot without having to see another card. At each stage of this hand, your disciplined approach pays off. By raising with a premium hand from early position, you immediately signal strength. The middle position player calls, but the rest of the table stays out of the way, respecting your range. On the flop, you have 2 overcards and a backdoor flush draw, but no made hand yet. Still, your continuation bet represents a strong range, and your opponent folds rather than challenge you. You win the pot without having to risk more chips or see difficult turns and rivers. This is the reward for playing tight and aggressive. You avoid unnecessary risk and maximize the pressure on your opponents. The most important lesson here is that by being selective and disciplined, you earn respect at the table. You do not need to play every hand or make wild bluffs to win. Instead, you let your opponents make mistakes while you stay in control. The outcome of this hand shows that tight play is not weak. It is a strategy built on confidence and understanding of the game. You do not have to prove anything to your opponents by playing more hands or making flashy moves. Your strength comes from knowing when to act and when to wait. Over time, this approach leads to more consistent results and fewer costly errors. In live $1, $3 games, where many players chase action and overlook discipline, your patience becomes your greatest advantage. By playing fewer hands and betting with purpose, you reduce the pressure you face and increase your chances of winning uncontested pots. This is how you build a solid foundation for long-term success at the table. Tight is not weak. Tight is strong, steady and profitable. Chapter 4. Limping versus raising. Preflop. Giving up the first bet before the flop means surrendering control of the hand to your opponents. When you choose to just call the big blind instead of raising, you allow the players behind you to decide how the rest of the hand will unfold. This is what it means to lose initiative. In low-stakes live games like $1, $2, and $1, $3 no-limit hold'em, many players find comfort in limping. It feels safe to see a flop for the minimum, but this comfort is deceptive. By not raising, you invite the rest of the table to join the pot, and you make it much easier for aggressive players to take charge. When you limp, you are no longer the one asking questions. Instead, you are forced to answer them. This shift in control can quickly put you in difficult situations, especially when you are out of position. For example, imagine you are sitting in middle position, with a hand that looks playable but is not strong enough to raise. You limp, hoping to see a cheap flop. A player in a later seat, perhaps on the cutoff, notices your passive action and raises to a much larger amount. Now you are faced with a tough decision. If you call, you are out of position, playing a bigger pot with a weaker hand and no initiative. If you fold, you have wasted your initial call and gained nothing. This is a common pattern in live games. Limping often leads to either folding to a raise or calling and then folding on the flop, which chips away at your stack over time. The statistics from thousands of hands at these stakes show that players who limp pre-flop win smaller pots and lose more often than those who raise. Limped pots tend to go multiway, making it even harder to win without a strong hand. Each additional limper draws in more callers, and the pot becomes crowded. In these situations, your chances of winning the hand drop, and your decisions become more complicated. The comfort of limping is an illusion. In reality, it puts you on the defensive and leaves you reacting to the actions of others. Taking the first aggressive action before the flop brings clarity and control to your decisions. When you raise instead of limping, you force your opponents to respond. This is called having initiative. At the $1, $2, and $1, $3 tables, raising preflop gives you several important advantages. First, you create fold equity. By making a raise, you give your opponents a chance to fold hands that might have some value but are not strong enough to continue. This means you can win the pot outright before the flop, or at least reduce the number of players who see the flop with you. Fewer opponents make it easier to read the board and to represent strong hands later. Second, raising builds a larger pot right away. This changes the way you approach the hand after the flop. With a bigger pot, your continuation bets have more impact, and you can make decisions about pot control more effectively. The size of the pot helps define your options and makes your choices simpler. Third, when you raise first in, you define your range of hands. Other players will expect you to have stronger cards, and this allows you to represent strength on many flops, even when you miss. You can make a single continuation bet and often take down the pot, or you can slow down if the board is dangerous. This clarity is missing when you limp. Without initiative, you are left guessing about your opponent's hands and intentions. Raising pre-flop is not just about building a pot, it is about making the rest of the hand easier to play. You are the one setting the pace, and your decisions become more straightforward. The benefits of raising are clear in the long run. Players who raise pre-flop at these stakes tend to win more pots, face fewer difficult decisions, and keep control of the action. There is a simple rule that helps avoid the problems caused by limping. This is the raise or fold rule. The idea is to treat open limping as something you do only in rare situations, and only when you have a clear plan for how to play after the flop. For most hands, you should either raise or fold before the flop. If a hand is not strong enough to raise, it is not strong enough to play. This rule keeps you out of trouble and prevents you from getting drawn into awkward spots with marginal hands. It also helps you build good habits and a solid foundation for your game. When you follow the raise or fold rule, you avoid the trap of limping with hands that look tempting but are not really profitable. For example, consider a situation where you are in middle position with the Queen of Clubs and Jack of Clubs. You have 100 big blinds in your stack, and the action folds to you. The hand looks playable, but it is not strong enough to raise from this position. If you limp, you invite the players behind you to attack. In this case, the player in the cutoff, who is known to play a wide and aggressive range, raises to $18. The blinds fold, and you decide to call. The pot is now $41, and you are out of position against a tough opponent. The flop comes 8 of spades, 6 of diamonds, and 2 of hearts. You check, and the cutoff bets $25. With nothing but overcards and no draw, you have to fold. The cutoff wins the pot, without a fight. This entire situation could have been avoided by following the raise or fold rule. If you had folded Queen-Jack suited pre-flop, you would not have lost money in a spot where you had little chance to win. If you had raised, you would have taken control of the hand and given yourself a better chance to win the pot outright, or play a simpler post-flop scenario. The mistake was the initial limp, which gave up initiative and put you in a defensive position. The raise or fold rule is designed to prevent exactly this kind of problem. By sticking to it, you keep yourself out of difficult situations and make your decisions easier. Over time, this approach leads to better results and a more confident, consistent game. The lesson is that limping may feel safe, but it actually puts you at a disadvantage. Raising pre-flop gives you control, creates fold equity, and makes your decisions simpler. By following the raise or fold rule, you avoid the pitfalls of passive play and build a stronger foundation for your poker game. At the $1, $2, and $1, $3 tables, these habits make a real difference. Each hand you play with purpose and initiative brings you closer to steady, confident results. Let these ideas settle in as you rest, knowing that each small adjustment brings you closer to the calm, clear game you want to play. Chapter 5. Why Cold Calling Preflop Loses Money. Choosing to call a preflop raise without having already invested in the pot often leads to long-term losses in live $1, $2, and $1, $3 no-limit hold'em games. This action, known as cold calling, means matching an opponent's open raise as your first involvement in the hand. Many players at these stakes find themselves drawn to this play, especially when holding cards that seem too good to fold but not quite strong enough to raise. The temptation is understandable. At a busy casino table, it can feel comfortable to see a flop with a hand like Queen Jack suited or Ace 10 offsuit, especially when the raise is a standard size and you are sitting in a position like the cutoff or button. The thinking goes that if the hand connects, you might win a big pot, and if not, you can fold without too much pain. This mindset is common, and it is easy to see why cold calling is frequent in these games. Players often prefer to call a single raise, rather than risk more chips by re-raising, and the idea of seeing a flop with a hand that has some potential is appealing. However, this habit leads to subtle but significant problems that add up over time. When you cold call pre-flop, you immediately put yourself in a reactive position for the rest of the hand. The original raiser keeps the advantage of initiative, which means they are expected to have the stronger range of hands and can represent strength on future betting rounds. Your own range, by contrast, is capped. This means that by just calling, you signal to observant opponents that you likely do not have the very strongest hands, such as pocket aces, pocket kings, pocket queens, or ace-king, since those hands are usually played more aggressively with a re-raise. This information makes you easier to play against. After the flop, the original raiser can continue betting with confidence, knowing you are less likely to have the top of the range. If you are out of position, you will have to act first on every street, making it even harder to realize your hand's potential. Even when you have position, such as being on the button, you still lack the initiative and are forced to respond to the raiser's bets. Another risk is that cold calling does not close the action. Players left to act behind you can choose to re-raise, putting you in a tough spot, or forcing you to fold and lose your initial investment. These factors combine to create weak defensive situations where you are often guessing and reacting, rather than controlling the hand. To see how this plays out in practice, consider a typical hand at a $1, $3 table. Both players have 100 big blinds in their stacks, which is the standard buy-in for these games. The action begins with a player in middle position, raising to $12. This player is opening with a solid range of hands, including Ace-Jack offsuit or better, Ace-10 suited or better, King-Queen offsuit, King-Queen suited, Queen-Jack suited, pocket nines or higher, and suited connectors, starting from 7-6 suited. You are sitting in the cutoff and look down at Queen of Spades and Jack of Spades. The temptation to call is strong. Queen-Jack suited looks attractive, and you might imagine flopping a straight or a flush. You decide to cold call the $12 raise. The button and both blinds fold, leaving you heads up against the original raiser. The pot is now $29. The flop comes 8 of diamonds, 4 of clubs, and 2 of hearts. The original raiser bets $20 into the pot. You have missed the flop completely. With Queen-Jack of Spades, you have no pair, no flush draw, and no straight draw. Still, you call the $20 bet. hoping to improve on the turn, or perhaps take the pot away later. The turn is the 7 of clubs. The original raiser bets $40. At this point, you have no pair and no meaningful draw. You decide to fold, unable to continue. The hand ends there, and you lose the $32 you invested pre-flop and on the flop. In this situation, your hand never improved, and you were forced to give up without seeing a showdown. In this example, the cold call with Queen-Jack suited put you in a difficult spot from the start. The middle position raiser had a strong range, and by just calling, you signaled that you did not have a premium hand. When the flop missed your hand, you were left with few options. Calling the flop bet was already a stretch, and the turn bet forced you to fold, realizing no equity and losing your initial investment. The original raiser won the pot, without having to show their cards, simply by maintaining the initiative and applying pressure. This is a common outcome when cold calling pre-flop. The main mistake was entering the pot with a call instead of making a clear decision to fold or raise. Folding would have cost you nothing, and raising would have put pressure back on the original raiser, possibly forcing them to fold weaker hands, or at least defining your own range as stronger. The lesson here is that folding or raising pre-flop are much cleaner, more profitable alternatives to cold calling. When you fold, you avoid entering pots with marginal hands, and do not risk chips in weak reactive situations. When you raise, especially with premium hands like pocket aces or pocket kings, you take control of the hand, build the pot, and deny your opponents the chance to see a cheap flop. Raising also defines your range as strong, making you harder to play against. Cold calling, by contrast, leaves you caught in the middle. You have invested chips but have not taken control, and you are left to react to the original raiser's bets. Over time, this approach leads to small but steady losses, as you are forced to fold on later streets, or call with hands that are rarely ahead. At the low-stakes live tables, it is easy to fall into the habit of cold calling, especially when the action is fast and the urge to play hands is strong. But by choosing to fold or raise instead, you put yourself in stronger positions and avoid the traps that come from playing passively. Remember that every decision pre-flop shapes the rest of the hand. By acting decisively and avoiding cold calls, you set yourself up for more profitable sessions and a more enjoyable experience at the table. Let this approach settle into your routine, and notice how your results improve as you make cleaner, more confident choices before the flop. Chapter 6. Raise bigger than you think. Small pre-flop raises in live $1, $3 games often lead to crowded pots and difficult post-flop decisions. When the initial raise is only 2 or 3 times the big blind, it rarely convinces opponents to fold. Instead, players in middle and late positions are likely to call with a wide range of hands, including offsuit broadways, low pocket pairs, and suited connectors that are not particularly strong. This tendency is especially common in low-stakes casino games, where many players are eager to see a flop and are not deterred by a small price. As a result, the pot often becomes multiway, with 3, 4, or even more players seeing the flop together. This situation makes it much harder for the original raiser to know where they stand after the flop, since so many different hand types are possible among the callers. The more players in the pot, the greater the chance that someone connects with the board in a way that is difficult to predict or control. Small raises simply do not provide enough pressure to thin the field, and this lack of selectivity leads to more complicated and less profitable situations for the raiser. In these games, it is common to see a player raise to $6 or $9, only to be called by several opponents, making it nearly impossible to isolate a single player or to represent a strong hand with confidence. The strategic consequence is clear. Small preflop raises fail to achieve the goal of narrowing the field, and this failure creates unnecessary challenges for the rest of the hand. Increasing the size of your preflop raise changes the entire dynamic of the hand. When you make a larger open, such as raising to $15 or $18 instead of $6 or $9, you force each potential caller to commit a more significant portion of their stack just to see the flop. This higher price discourages players with marginal hands from continuing, especially those in the blinds or late positions who might otherwise call with speculative holdings. The effect is that the number of callers drops, and the pot is much more likely to be contested heads up or with only one other player. This reduction in field size makes post-flop play far simpler and more manageable. With fewer opponents, the range of possible hands you face narrows, and you can make clearer decisions based on the board and the action. Larger raises also shift the risk and reward for the callers. They must now consider whether their hand is truly strong enough to justify the extra chips, and many will fold hands they would have called with against a smaller raise. This means that when you do get called, you are more likely to be up against hands that are easier to read and play against, rather than a jumble of weak and unpredictable holdings. The overall result is a cleaner, more straightforward post-flop environment, where your strong hands can extract value and your bluffs are more credible. By raising bigger, you take control of the hand early and set yourself up for success throughout the rest of the pot. To see how this works in practice, imagine a typical hand at a $1, $3 table with 100 big blinds effective stacks. You are sitting under the gun, and you look down at ace of spades and king of clubs. The button is a loose and aggressive player who is known to call with a wide range of hands, including Broadway cards, suited aces, suited connectors, starting from 5-4 suited, suited gappers, all pocket pairs, and even some offsuit Broadways. Instead of making a small raise, you confidently put out $18. The action folds around to the button, who calls, and both blinds fold. Now the pot is $43, and you are heads up against a single opponent. The flop comes king of diamonds, 9 of clubs, and 4 of spades. You make a continuation bet of $30, and the button calls. The pot is now $103. On the turn, the 3 of hearts appears. You bet $60, and the button folds. At this point, your hand is strong top pair with the best possible kicker on a relatively dry board. The larger preflop raise has done its job. It has isolated you against a single opponent, kept the pot manageable, and allowed you to play your strong hand with confidence. There is no need to guess what 3 or 4 other players might have, and you are able to extract value from worse hands while protecting your equity. The hand ends cleanly, with your opponent folding and you taking down the pot without further resistance. The key to this outcome is the preflop sizing. By raising bigger, you avoided the confusion and risk that come with multi-way pots, and you set up a straightforward path to victory. Choosing a consistent, larger raise size for most of your hands brings stability and clarity to your preflop strategy. When you use the same confident sizing from each position, you remove the need to constantly adjust and second-guess your decisions. This approach also signals to the table that you are not raising light or weak, which further discourages loose calls. A standard open size that reliably produces heads-up pots against the blinds is ideal, as it allows you to build your hand ranges and post-flop plans with greater precision. For example, opening to $15 or $18 from early or middle position with your strong hands and playable holdings will usually limit the field to 1 or 2 callers at most. This makes it easier to read the board, understand your opponent's likely range, and make profitable decisions after the flop. In contrast, using a small raise size invites more players into the pot, increases the unpredictability of the hand, and makes it harder to extract value or protect your equity. The difference in outcomes is clear. Larger, consistent raises lead to simpler, more profitable situations, while small raises create unnecessary complications. By adopting a bigger standard open, you give yourself the best chance to control the action and maximize your results in live $1, $3 games. The lesson is simple and practical. In these games, it pays to raise bigger than you might think is necessary. Small raises do not accomplish the goal of narrowing the field, and they often lead to difficult multi-way pots. Larger raises, used consistently, reduce the number of callers, create clearer post-flop situations, and allow your strong hands to shine. By making this adjustment, you set yourself up for success and make your sessions at the table more comfortable and rewarding. Let this approach become second nature, and you will find that your decisions become easier, your results more predictable, and your confidence at the table steadily grows. Chapter 7. Position matters more than your cards. The order in which you act at the poker table shapes every decision you make, and often matters more than the cards you are dealt. When you are the last to act in a hand, you gain a clear advantage by seeing what your opponents do before you make your own choice. This extra information lets you respond with more confidence, whether you are deciding to bet, call, or fold. In live $1, $2, and $1, $3 no-limit hold'em games, this advantage is especially important because players often reveal their intentions through their actions. When you act last, you can watch for signs of strength or weakness, and you can control the size of the pot by choosing to bet or check after your opponents have acted. This control helps you avoid costly mistakes and gives you the freedom to realize the full value of your hand, or to escape when the situation looks dangerous. Acting last means you can gather information from every player who acts before you. If your opponent checks, you know they may not have a strong hand. If they bet, you can judge the size of their bet and consider what it means. This information is not available to players who act earlier in the hand. When you are in position, you can also decide to check behind on the turn or river, especially if you have a marginal hand. This lets you see a free card or get to showdown without risking more chips. In live games, this is a powerful tool because it allows you to play suited connectors and other speculative hands more profitably. You can take a free card when you need it, or apply pressure when your opponent shows weakness. The ability to control the action and the pot size is one of the main reasons why players who act last win more money over time. In fact, the difference in win rates between early and late positions is one of the most consistent patterns in live cash games. Players who act last tend to make fewer mistakes and capture more value, simply because they have more information and more control. When you are forced to act first, the situation changes completely. Acting early means you must make decisions without knowing what your opponents will do. You might bet with a decent hand, only to face a raise from a player who acts after you. Or you might check, giving your opponent the chance to take control of the pot. In early position, you are often left guessing about the strength of the hands behind you. This uncertainty makes it much harder to play marginal or speculative hands, because you have no way of knowing if you will be facing a big bet or a raise after you act. Even with strong hands, acting first can be uncomfortable. If you bet and get raised, you have to decide whether your hand is still good, but you have less information to guide you. This can lead to folding the best hand or overcommitting to a pot when you are actually behind. The risk of making a costly mistake is much higher when you act first, because you are always reacting to new information after you have already made your decision. Imagine sitting in early position with a hand that is not quite strong enough to play confidently. If you decide to enter the pot, you might face a raise from a player in late position. Now you are out of position for the rest of the hand, and you have to make difficult decisions without the benefit of seeing what your opponent will do first. This is why playing speculative hands from early position can be dangerous. You are forced to commit chips before you have enough information, and you often end up in tough spots after the flop. Even with premium hands, acting first can put you in a bind. If you bet and a player behind you raises, you have to decide whether to continue without knowing if they are bluffing or have a stronger hand. The disadvantage of acting first is a constant challenge in live cash games, and it is one of the main reasons why experienced players are careful about the hands they play from early position. Because of these differences, it is important to play more hands when you are in position, and fewer hands when you are out of position. When you are in late position, you can take advantage of your information edge by playing a wider range of hands. Suited connectors, small pairs, and other speculative hands become more valuable because you can control the action after the flop. You can check behind to see a free card, or you can bet to apply pressure when your opponent shows weakness. This flexibility allows you to capture value with strong hands and avoid losing too much with weaker ones. On the other hand, when you are out of position, you should tighten up and play only your strongest hands. Folding marginal hands out of position saves you money by keeping you out of difficult spots where you have to guess what your opponent will do. The difference in profitability between playing in position and out of position is clear in live $1, $2, and $1, $3 games. Players who focus on playing more hands in position and fewer hands out of position consistently see better results over time. Let's look at a hand that shows how acting last can turn a speculative hand into a profitable play. Both players start with stacks of about 120 times the big blind. The opponent is in middle position and opens the betting to $12. This player is likely holding a range of hands that includes ace-jack offsuit or better, ace-10 suited or better, king-queen offsuit, king-queen suited, queen-jack suited, pocket nines or higher, and suited connectors starting from 7, 6 suited. The action folds to you on the button. You hold the queen of spades and jack of spades. The blinds fold, and you call, taking advantage of your position. The pot is now $29. The flop comes 9 of spades, 7 of clubs, and 2 of spades. The opponent bets $18. You have a flush draw, with 9 outs to the best possible flush. You call, using your position to see what the opponent will do on the next street. The pot is now $65. On the turn, the 4 of clubs appears. The opponent checks. Now you have the chance to take control of the hand. You bet $35. The opponent folds, and you win the pot without needing to see the river. At this point, you still have a flush draw, but your position allows you to apply pressure and represent a strong hand. The stack depth means you could threaten a large bet on the river, making your bluff more believable. In this hand, your use of position is the key to success. By calling pre-flop on the button, you maximize your informational advantage with a suited connected hand. On the flop, you call with a strong draw, knowing you will act last on future streets. When the opponent checks the turn, you bet and force a fold, winning the pot without needing to make your hand. If you had played this hand out of position, you would have faced much tougher decisions and might not have been able to apply the same pressure. Acting last lets you control the pot, apply pressure when your opponent shows weakness, and avoid overcommitting with a draw. This is a clear example of why position matters more than your cards in live low-stakes cash games. The lesson is simple and powerful. Acting last gives you more information, more control, and more ways to win. When you are in position, you can play a wider range of hands and make better decisions after the flop. When you are out of position, you should be more selective and avoid difficult spots. Over time, focusing on position will help you make fewer mistakes and capture more value, no matter what cards you are dealt. Let this idea guide your decisions at the table, and you will find yourself in more comfortable situations, making better choices, and seeing more consistent results. Chapter 8. Bet your good hands. Failing to bet when holding a strong hand often leads to missed profit, especially in live $1, $2, and $1, $3 games. When you check with a powerful holding, you give your opponents a free chance to improve their hands. This can reduce your advantage and allow them to catch up, sometimes even overtaking your lead. In these games, the value of a strong hand is not just in its current strength, but in its ability to build the pot when opponents call. If you check, you miss the chance to grow the pot and to get paid by players who are willing to call with weaker hands. Imagine you are sitting at the table with a strong hand, such as top pair or better, and you decide to check the flop. Your opponent, who might have called a bet with a weaker pair or a draw, now gets to see the next card for free. If that card helps them, you may lose a pot you could have won, or you may be forced to fold later when the board gets dangerous. Even if you still win, the pot is smaller than it could have been. In live low-stakes games, the difference between betting and checking can add up over time. Each time you check a strong hand, you lose the chance to win more than just the current pot. Over many sessions, this habit can cost you a significant amount of money. Betting your good hands is not about being aggressive for its own sake. It is about making sure you get paid when you are ahead, and not giving away free cards that can hurt you. The best way to maximize your profit is to bet when you expect to be called by worse hands, and in these games, that situation comes up often. Live $1, $2, and $1, $3 games are filled with players who call too often. Many opponents in these games are not disciplined folders. They like to see more cards, and are curious about what you have. This tendency makes value betting with strong hands especially profitable. When you bet with a good hand, you are not just hoping to get called by another strong hand. You are targeting all the weaker hands that your opponents will call with. For example, if you have top pair with a strong kicker, many players will call your bet with second pair, bottom pair, or even just a draw. They do not want to fold, and they are willing to put more money in the pot with hands that are behind. This is why betting for value works so well in these games. You do not need to worry that your opponents will fold too much. In fact, the opposite is true. They will often call with hands that have little chance of winning. This means that every time you bet your strong hands, you are likely to get called by worse. Even hands that would have checked behind if you checked to them will often call a bet. This is a direct source of profit. By betting, you force your opponents to put more money in the pot, with hands that are not as strong as yours. Over time, this adds up to a significant edge. The key is to recognize that your opponent's willingness to call is not a weakness to exploit with bluffs, but an opportunity to get paid when you have the best hand. Focus on betting your good hands and letting your opponents make the mistake of calling with worse. Betting confidently when you are ahead is a habit that pays off in the long run. When you have the best hand, your goal should be to build the pot and extract as much value as possible from your opponents. This means betting on every street when the situation calls for it, especially when you expect to be called by worse hands. Many players are tempted to slow play their strong hands, hoping to trap their opponents or induce a bluff. In low-stakes live games, this approach often backfires. By checking, you give up the chance to build the pot, and you risk letting your opponents catch up for free. Instead, you should focus on betting for value, and trusting that your opponents will call with hands that are not as strong as yours. This approach is especially effective when the stacks are deep enough to allow for multiple streets of betting without making the pot too large for your opponents to call. When you bet confidently, you put pressure on your opponents to make mistakes, and you make it difficult for them to realize their equity by seeing free cards. The most important thing is to recognize when you are ahead, and to act on that knowledge by betting for value. Let's look at a hand that shows the power of betting your good hands for value. The stacks are 100 big blinds effective, which is a typical depth for live $1, $3 games. The player in the cutoff, who is known to play a wide and aggressive range, opens the action. This player is likely to have many types of hands, including suited aces, suited connectors, small pairs, and Broadway cards. You are on the button and look down at two kings, the king of clubs and the king of diamonds. With such a strong hand, you raise to build the pot and to isolate the initial raiser. The blinds fold, and the cutoff calls your raise. The pot is now substantial, and you are in position with a premium hand. On the flop, the board comes king of spades, 8 of spades, and 4 of hearts. The cutoff checks to you. This is a draw-heavy board, and you have top set, which is a very strong made hand. Betting here is important, because there are many worse hands and draws that will call. You bet, and the cutoff calls. The pot grows, and you are still well ahead with top set. The turn brings the 2 of clubs. The cutoff checks again. You continue to bet for value, knowing that many worse hands and unfinished draws will still call. The cutoff calls your bet, and the pot becomes even larger. You still have top set, and your hand is very strong against the likely range of hands your opponent could have. The river is the 9 of clubs. The cutoff checks a third time. You bet again, targeting all the weaker hands that might call. The cutoff calls, and you show your top set of kings. You win the pot, having built it up on every street by betting for value. The key lesson from this hand is that betting your strong hands on every street maximizes your profit against opponents who call too wide. At no point did you slow down or check, because you recognized that your hand was ahead of your opponent's likely range. If you had checked on any street, you would have missed the chance to build the pot and to get paid by worse hands. In live $1, $3 games, this approach is especially effective, because your opponents are willing to call with hands that are not as strong as yours. By betting confidently, when you are ahead, you take full advantage of their tendencies and ensure that you get the most value from your best hands. Developing the habit of betting your good hands for value is one of the most important skills you can build in live low-stakes cash games. Each time you bet and get called by a worse hand, you are adding to your long-term winnings. Avoid the temptation to slow play or to give free cards when you are ahead. Trust that your opponents will call with hands that are not as strong as yours, and focus on building the pot when you have the advantage. Over time, this approach will help you steadily grow your results and make the most of every strong hand you are dealt. Chapter 9. One pair hands, and knowing when to slow down. Recognizing the true value of a single pair in live $1, $2, and $1, $3 games shapes your entire approach to post-flop play. When you hold a pair that matches the highest card on the board, it can feel like a powerful hand, especially in a heads-up situation. Yet the real strength of this holding depends on the board's texture and the actions of your opponent. In many cases, especially on simple, uncoordinated flops, a single pair is often the best hand, and deserves to be played assertively. For example, when the board comes out with 3 different low cards and no flush or straight draws, such as a king, a 7, and a 4 of all different suits, your top pair is usually ahead of most hands your opponent might have. In these spots, betting for value is the right choice. Your opponent's range will often include many hands that miss the flop entirely, or have only weaker pairs. On these dry boards, especially when you are in position, you can confidently bet your top pair, knowing that you are likely to be called by worse hands. This is a common situation in live low-stakes games, where players call preflop with a wide variety of hands. When the board is simple and your opponent's range is broad, your one pair is strong enough to extract value. Many players at these stakes do not fold easily, so betting your top pair on these boards is both safe and profitable. Remember, the absence of draws and the heads-up nature of the pot are key reasons why your one pair remains strong. When the board is dry and your opponent's range is wide, you can trust that your top pair is often best and deserves a bet. As the hand progresses, however, the situation can change quickly. There are clear warning signs that your single pair may no longer be the best hand. When new cards arrive that are higher than your pair, or when the board becomes more connected, you must pause and reconsider. For example, if you have a pair of queens and a king appears on the turn or river, this is a classic scare card. It is a signal that your opponent could now have a stronger pair, especially if they continue to bet aggressively. Similarly, if the board starts to show possible straight or flush combinations, your one pair loses much of its value. Another important sign is your opponent's betting pattern. If a player who has been cautious suddenly starts making large bets after the board changes, this often means they have improved to a hand that beats one pair. In live low-stakes games, continued aggression from a tight or careful player is rarely a bluff. When you see large bets on later streets, especially after the board becomes more dangerous, you must be willing to slow down. The presence of overcards, new draws, and increased aggression are all signals that your one pair may not be enough. Paying attention to these signs helps you avoid costly mistakes and protects your stack from unnecessary losses. To understand how these ideas play out in real time, consider a hand played with deep stacks, where both players have about 120 big blinds. The action begins with a player in middle position, raising to $12. You are in the cutoff seat and look down at the Queen of Spades and Jack of Spades. This is a reasonable hand to call with in position against a standard opening range, which might include hands like Ace-Jack, King-Queen, suited connectors, and pocket pairs. The blinds fold, and you go heads up to the flop with a pot of $29. The flop comes Queen of Diamonds, 7 of Clubs, and 3 of Hearts. The board is dry, with no flush or straight draws. Your opponent bets $20, and you call. At this moment you have top pair with a jack kicker on a simple board, and your hand is likely ahead of most of your opponent's range. The turn brings the 8 of Spades, which adds some straight possibilities, but the board is still not highly coordinated. Your opponent bets $45, and you call again. Now, your top pair faces more risk, as the board is starting to offer more potential for stronger hands. The pot is now $159. The river is the King of Clubs, a significant overcard that completes several possible hands. Your opponent bets $90. You call, and your opponent reveals the King of Hearts and King of Spades for a set of kings, winning the pot. On the flop, your call with top pair was reasonable, given the dry board and your opponent's range. On the turn, the board became more dangerous, and your opponent's continued aggression was a warning sign. The river brought a scare card, and the large bet should have signaled that your one pair was no longer likely to be best. The mistake was failing to slow down after the turn, and making a large call on the river, when all signs pointed to your opponent having a stronger hand. This hand highlights a common trap in live low-stakes games, overcommitting with one pair, when the situation calls for caution. Many players at these stakes fall into the habit of calling down with one pair across multiple streets, especially when they start with top pair on the flop. However, one pair is often best treated as a one-street hand. This means you should be willing to bet or call once, but become much more careful as the board develops and your opponent continues to show strength. In live games, players who bet heavily on the turn and river usually have a strong hand. By controlling the size of the pot and slowing down after the first sign of trouble, you protect yourself from losing large amounts with a hand that is no longer likely to be best. The key is to recognize when the board and your opponent's actions have changed the situation. When you see scare cards, increased aggression, or new draws, it is time to pause and consider folding or checking instead of betting or calling again. This approach keeps your losses small when you are behind, and allows you to maximize value when your one pair is truly strong. The lesson is simple but important. In live $1, $2, and $1, $3 games, one pair can be a strong hand on the right board, but it is rarely worth risking your entire stack as the board changes and your opponent becomes more aggressive. Trust your read on the board and the action. Be willing to slow down and let go of one pair when the signs are clear. By doing so, you will avoid the most common and costly mistake at these stakes, paying off big bets with a hand that is no longer good. Over time, this discipline will protect your bankroll and help you become a more consistent winner at the table. Let yourself relax into this mindset, knowing that patience and caution with one pair hands are the foundation of solid long-term results in live low-stakes poker. Chapter 10. Big bets usually mean big hands. When players in live $1, $3 no-limit hold'em push forward a large stack of chips, it is almost always a sign that they are holding a strong hand. In these games, the size of a bet often tells a clear story about a player's confidence. When someone bets the size of the pot, or even more, especially on the turn or river, they are usually not bluffing or unsure. Instead, they are trying to get as much value as possible from opponents who might call with weaker hands. This is a pattern that repeats itself at nearly every table. Players who are confident in their hand strength tend to show it not just with their bet size, but also with their body language. You might notice a steady posture, direct eye contact, or a calm way of moving chips forward. These are not always perfect signals, but in low-stakes live games, they often accompany strong value bets. When you see a player make a large bet, especially after betting on previous streets, it is wise to assume they have at least top pair with a strong kicker, two pair, or even better. The bigger the bet, the more likely it is that the player is holding a hand they want to get paid off with. This is especially true when the bet comes on the river, after a pattern of aggression. In these situations, most players are not trying to scare you out of the pot with nothing. They are trying to get called by worse hands, and their confidence is usually real. On the other hand, small bets often tell a different story. When a player bets just a small fraction of the pot, it is usually not a sign of great strength. Instead, these small bets are often used as a way to test the waters with a medium-strength hand or a drawing hand. You might see a player hesitate, then put out a small bet, hoping to see how their opponent reacts. This hesitation is a sign of uncertainty. The player is not sure if their hand is good enough to bet big, so they choose a smaller amount. Sometimes, you will see a quick, almost automatic small bet or call. This is also a sign that the player is not holding a monster hand. They want to see the next card as cheaply as possible, or they want to avoid facing a big raise. In live $1, $3 games, these small bets are rarely made with very strong hands. Instead, they are more often used with hands like middle pair, weak top pair, or a draw that has not yet improved. When you see a small bet, you can usually rule out the very strongest hands. Players who have a big hand want to get paid, so they bet big. Players who are unsure, or who want to control the size of the pot, tend to bet small. Recognizing this pattern can help you avoid paying off big bets with weak hands, and can help you decide when to apply pressure yourself. There is a lesson in respecting large bets, especially on the river. In low-stakes live games, calling a big river bet is rarely profitable, unless you have a very strong hand yourself. The statistics from these games show that when players call large river bets, they are usually shown a strong hand at showdown. This is because most players at these stakes are not bluffing with big bets. They are betting big because they want to get called by worse hands. When you face a large bet after your opponent has shown aggression on every street, it is important to pause and consider what they are representing. If you only have a medium-strength hand, it is usually best to fold. Making a hero call with a weak hand might feel tempting, but over time it will cost you money. The discipline to fold in these spots is one of the most important skills you can develop in live cash games. It is not easy to let go of a hand you liked, but folding to a big bet when the story makes sense is almost always the right move. Let's look at a hand that shows how this discipline pays off. The stacks are 120 big blinds deep, which is a typical amount for a live $1, $3 game. The action starts with a player in middle position, who opens the betting to $12. This is a standard raise size for these games. The action folds around to the button, who holds two jacks, the jack of spades and the jack of hearts. Pocket jacks are a strong hand in this spot, and calling in position is the correct play against a middle position opener. The blinds fold, and the pot is now $29. The flop comes 8 of clubs, 4 of diamonds, and 2 of spades. The middle position player continues with a bet of $20. This is a standard continuation bet, and with an overpair to the board, the button calls. At this point, the button's hand is still an overpair, which is ahead of most hands the opener could have. The pot is now $69. The turn brings the 7 of spades. The middle position player bets $50, a larger bet that shows continued aggression. The button calls again. Now the button still has an overpair, but the repeated aggression from the opponent is starting to narrow their range towards stronger hands or committed draws. The pot has grown to $169. The river is the 2 of hearts. The middle position player now moves all in for $120, a large bet that is nearly the size of the pot. At this point, the button faces a difficult decision. The opponent has bet on every street and is now making a big river bet. In live $1, $3 games, this pattern almost always means a very strong hand. The button decides to fold, and the middle position player wins the pot. This hand is a good example of why it is important to respect big bets in live low-stakes games. The button played the hand well by calling preflop and on the flop with a strong overpair. The turn call was marginal but understandable, given the strength of the hand and the opponent's range. However, when faced with a large all-in bet on the river, after 3 streets of aggression, the button made the disciplined choice to fold. This is the kind of decision that saves chips over the long run. In these games, big bets are almost always value bets, not bluffs. Folding in these spots is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of understanding how live players behave. By paying attention to bet sizing and recognizing when a big bet means a big hand, you can avoid costly mistakes and keep your stack healthy. The patterns of betting in live $1, $3 games are clear and consistent. Large bets are usually made with strong hands, while small bets often signal uncertainty or a desire to see another card cheaply. When you face a big bet, especially after a pattern of aggression, it is wise to give your opponent credit for a strong hand. Folding in these spots is not just safe, it is the right play most of the time. Over time, this discipline will help you keep your losses small and your wins steady. As you drift off, remember that in these games, big bets usually mean big hands, and respecting that pattern is one of the most reliable ways to succeed. Chapter 11. Multiway pots change everything. The presence of several opponents in a single hand changes the value of every decision you make at the table. In live $1, $2, and $1, $3 no-limit hold'em games, it is common to see 4 or more players seeing the flop together. This is not just a quirk of the game, but a direct result of how players approach the early betting rounds. Many players at these stakes prefer to limp into the pot, or call preflop raises with a wide range of hands. Instead of folding or re-raising, they often choose to see a flop, especially when stacks are deep and the cost of calling seems small compared to the potential reward. The result is that even when someone raises from early position, it is not unusual for the cutoff, the button, and both blinds to call, creating a pot with 5 or 6 players before the community cards are even dealt. This tendency is reinforced by the table dynamics you will find in most live low-stakes games. Players behind the initial raiser are more likely to flat call than to isolate, and the deep stacks, often around 200 big blinds, encourage players to take a chance with hands that might be folded in a tougher or shorter stacked game. The rhythm of the table, the social atmosphere, and the desire to see more flops all work together to make multiway pots a regular feature of these games. When several players see the flop together, the value of your hand changes in important ways. Hands that feel strong in a heads-up pot can become fragile when you are facing 3 or 4 opponents. For example, if you have pocket jacks and the flop comes with low cards, you might feel comfortable continuing against a single opponent's bet. But in a 4-way pot, that same hand is much more vulnerable. The chance that someone has flopped a set or 2 pair increases with every extra player in the hand. Even top pair with a good kicker, such as ace-queen on a queen-high board, is not as reliable when there are multiple opponents. In a 3-way pot, you might still bet for value, but in a 5-way pot, you need to be much more cautious. The more players that see the flop, the more likely it is that someone has connected with the board in a way that beats your single pair. This is why you will often see hands that would be automatic bets in a heads-up pot become checks or even folds when the pot is multiway. The presence of several opponents means that your hand must be stronger to justify putting more money into the pot. It is not just about the absolute strength of your cards, but about how they stand up against a wider range of possible hands held by your opponents. To adjust for this, you need to raise your standards for what counts as a strong hand in a multi-way pot. This is called tightening your value thresholds. In practical terms, this means folding hands like pocket jacks or suited Broadway cards that you might continue with heads up, especially if you are facing a bet and a call in front of you. Marginal top pairs, such as king-queen on a queen-high board, lose much of their value when there are several players in the hand. The risk that someone has flopped 2 pair or a set is simply too high to justify playing a big pot with a hand that is unlikely to improve. In these situations, hands that are static bluff catchers or medium strength Hands that do not have a clear path to improving to the nuts become unprofitable. Instead, you want to focus on hands that can make the best possible hand, such as suited connectors that can make straights or flushes, or high pairs that can make sets. The live game environment, with its loose calls and deep stacks, increases the risk of being outdrawn, so it is important to play cautiously and avoid overcommitting with hands that are only medium strength. Checking or betting smaller with vulnerable holdings can help you control the size of the pot and avoid costly mistakes. Let's look at a hand that shows how failing to adjust for a multi-way pot can lead to trouble. Imagine you are sitting with a stack of 120 big blinds, and you are in early position, just after the under-the-gun player. The under-the-gun player limps into the pot, and you raise to $15. The player in middle position calls, as do the cutoff and the button. Both blinds call, and the original limper calls as well. Now there are 6 players in the pot, and the total in the middle is $90 before the flop is even dealt. This is a classic example of how live games create multi-way pots, a standard raise, followed by a cascade of calls from every direction. The flop comes Queen of Diamonds, 8 of Spades, 7 of Diamonds. Both blinds check. The under-the-gun player checks, and now it is your turn to act. You decide to bet $40 into the $90 pot. The player in middle position calls, while the cutoff and button fold. Both blinds fold, and the under-the-gun player folds as well. Now there are 2 players left, and the pot has grown to $170. At this point, your hand is top pair with a strong kicker, but you are facing an opponent who has called your bet in a multi-way pot. The turn is the 2 of clubs. You bet $80, and the middle position player calls again. The pot is now $330. Your hand is still top pair with a strong kicker, but the board is starting to look dangerous. There are possible straight and flush draws, and your opponent has continued to call large bets on both the flop and the turn. The river is the 4 of clubs. You check, and your opponent bets $100. You call, and your opponent shows a set of 7s, winning the pot. Your top pair with ace-queen was not enough to beat a set in this multi-way pot. This hand shows how easy it is to overvalue a hand like top pair, with a good kicker when several players see the flop. The pre-flop raise was standard, but with so many callers, you should have anticipated that the pot would be multi-way and adjusted your expectations. The flop bet was too large for a hand that is only top pair, especially against several opponents. Continuing to bet large on the turnover committed you with a vulnerable hand, failing to recognize the increased risk of sets and 2 pairs in a multi-way pot. With deep stacks and wide ranges, hands like sets and 2 pairs are much more likely, and top pair becomes a marginal holding. The most important mistake was not tightening your value thresholds and not betting cautiously in a multi-way pot. Checking or betting smaller on the flop and turn would have controlled the pot and made it easier to fold if faced with aggression later. Whenever you find yourself in a pot with several opponents, remember that the value of your hand is not the same as it would be heads up. The more players in the hand, the stronger your hand needs to be to continue betting for value. Marginal hands that might be profitable in a heads-up pot become dangerous in a multi-way setting. Focus on playing hands that can make the nuts, and be willing to check or fold hands that are only medium strength. By tightening your value thresholds and playing cautiously in multi-way pots, you can avoid costly mistakes and protect your stack in the long run. The rhythm of live low-stakes games will always create multi-way pots, but with patience and discipline, you can navigate them safely and profitably. Chapter 12. Drawing Hands and Simple Odds. Drawing hands can create tempting situations that lead to costly mistakes or well-timed folds, depending on how well you understand their likelihood of improving. When you hold two suited cards and see two more of that suit on the flop, you have what is called a flush draw. In these moments, it is important to remember that this type of draw will become a completed flush by the river, about 1 out of every 3 times. This means that on average, if you are in this situation 3 separate times, you will make your flush once. In live $1, $2, and $1, $3 games, many players get excited when they see a flush draw and will call large bets without thinking about how often the draw will actually come in. The reality is that a flush draw on the flop gives you 9 cards in the deck that will help you, and those 9 cards will show up by the river about 35% of the time. If you are only going to see one more card, such as on the turn, your chances drop to less than 1 in 5. This is why it is so important to be aware of how many cards are left to come and how much money you are being asked to put in the pot. Chasing a flush draw can be profitable when the price is right, but it is easy to lose money if you call too many large bets just hoping to get lucky. In these low-stakes games, you will often see players call all the way to the river with a flush draw, even when the odds are not in their favor. By remembering that a flush draw will only complete about 1 out of 3 times by the river, you can make better decisions and avoid the common trap of overvaluing your chances. Straight draws are another common situation that can look very appealing but require careful thought. The most straightforward type is called an open-ended straight draw. This happens when you have 4 cards in a row and need either one of 2 ranks to complete your straight. For example, if you hold 6 and 7 and the board shows 5 and 8, you need either a 4 or a 9 to make your straight. There are 8 cards in the deck that will help you in this case. An open-ended straight draw will complete by the river slightly less often than a flush draw, coming in about 32% of the time. This is just under 1 out of every 3 tries. The odds against hitting your straight are a little steeper than with a flush draw, so it is important to be even more cautious when deciding whether to call a bet. There is also a type of straight draw called a gut shot, where you need one specific card to complete your straight. For example, if you have 6 and 8 and the board is 5 and 7, only a 7 will give you a straight. This gives you just 4 outs, and your chances of completing the straight by the river are much lower. Gut shot draws are tempting, but they do not come in often enough to justify calling large bets, unless the price is very low, or there are other reasons to continue. In live low-stakes games, it is common to see players chase straight draws without realizing how rarely they will actually hit. By keeping in mind that open-ended straight draws complete a little less than flush draws, and gut shots even less, you can avoid making calls that will lose money in the long run. The most helpful approach at the table is to remember just 2 simple odds. When you have a flush draw on the flop, you will make your flush about 1 out of 3 times by the river. When you have an open-ended straight draw, you will make your straight slightly less often. These are the only numbers you need to keep in mind for most decisions about drawing hands in live $1, $2, and $1, $3 games. There is no need to calculate exact percentages or memorize complicated charts. Trying to work out the exact odds in your head can slow you down and lead to mistakes, especially when the action is moving quickly. Instead, focus on these simple rules. Flush draws hit about 1 in 3 times, and straight draws hit a little less. This will help you make quick, confident decisions and avoid the trap of overthinking. Many players at these stakes get stuck trying to do math at the table and end up making poor decisions or acting too slowly. By trusting these basic odds, you can keep your play steady and consistent. Let's look at a hand that shows how these simple odds can guide your decisions. Imagine you are sitting in a $1, $3 game with stacks of about 80 big blinds. The player in the cutoff, who is known to play a wide and aggressive range, raises to $12. You are on the button with 9 of spades and 8 of spades. This is a suited connector, a hand that plays well in position against a wide range, so you call. The blinds fold, and you go to the flop heads up, with a pot of $29. The flop comes queen of spades, 7 of clubs, and 2 of spades. The cutoff bets $20. You have a flush draw, with 9 spades that can improve your hand. Remembering that a flush draw will complete about 1 out of 3 times by the river, you call the bet. The pot is now $69. The turn is the 4 of clubs. The cutoff bets $50. Now, you have to decide whether to continue. With only 1 card left to come, your chances of making the flush drop to less than 1 in 5. The bet is large compared to the pot, and you do not have the nut flush draw. This is a spot where many players make the mistake of calling, hoping to get lucky. But by remembering the simple odds, you recognize that the price is not right, and fold. The hand ends there, and you avoid a costly mistake. In this example, the most important decision was folding on the turn. Even though you had a strong draw on the flop, the situation changed when only 1 card was left to come, and the bet was large. By trusting the simple odds for flush draws, you made a disciplined fold and saved money. This is the kind of steady, practical decision-making that leads to long-term success in live low-stakes games. The key lesson is that you do not need to know every detail or run complex calculations. Just remember that flush draws complete about 1 out of 3 times by the river, and straight draws a little less. Use these numbers to guide your decisions, and you will avoid the most common mistakes players make with drawing hands. When you keep your approach simple and grounded, you can play with confidence and let the game come to you, 1 hand at a time. Chapter 13. Calling twice is the danger zone. Committing chips on both the flop and turn, with a hand that is not clearly strong, often leads to difficult situations and unnecessary losses in low-stakes live cash games. In these games, many players find themselves in trouble, not because they play too many hands before the flop, but because they continue too far with hands that are only marginally good. The first call on the flop is usually not the problem. In fact, calling a single bet on the flop is often the correct play with hands like middle pair or a strong draw, especially when you are in position and the board is not too coordinated. In a typical $1 $3 game, after a single raise and a call, the pot on the flop is usually around 9 big blinds. If you are holding a hand like middle pair, with a decent kicker, and your opponent bets about 60 to 75% of the pot, calling is a standard and reasonable decision. This call only commits about 5 to 7% of your starting stack, which is a manageable amount. You are not putting yourself at risk of losing a significant portion of your chips, and you have the opportunity to see another card and gather more information about your opponent's intentions. Hands with 6 to 8 outs, such as a straight or flush draw, also justify a single call on the flop. These hands have the potential to improve by the river, and the cost of calling 1 bet is relatively small compared to the possible reward. In these situations, the flop call is not dangerous on its own. It is simply a way to continue with hands that have some chance to improve, or are already ahead of weaker holdings in your opponent's range. The real danger begins when you call a second bet on the turn, with a hand that is not clearly strong. In live $1 $3 games, the average turn bet is often between 60 and 100% of the pot. This means that the amount you risk on the turn is usually double what you risked on the flop, and the total chips you have committed now becomes significant. After calling both the flop and turn bets, you will often have put in between 12 and 18% of your starting stack, especially when the pot has grown to 25 or 35 big blinds. This is a critical threshold. Once you have committed this much of your stack, your options become limited. The stack-to-pot ratio drops below 3-to-1, which means that if you face another bet on the river, you will have little room to maneuver. With a marginal hand, such as second pair, or a weak top pair, you are now in a position where folding becomes much more difficult, but calling again is rarely correct. The problem is that most opponents at these stakes are betting the turn for value or protection with hands that are stronger than yours. When the board becomes more coordinated, or an overcard appears, your hand's relative strength drops even further. By calling twice, you are often paying off opponents who have top pair or better, and you are exposing yourself to further pressure on the river. This is why calling both the flop and turn with a marginal hand is one of the most common and costly mistakes in low-stakes live games. Let's look at a practical example that shows how this mistake unfolds in real time. Imagine you are sitting in a $1, $3 game with 120 big blinds in your stack. The player in middle position, who is playing a standard range of strong Broadway cards, suited connectors, and pocket pairs, raises to $12. You are in the cutoff and look down at pocket nines. This is a reasonable hand to call with in position, so you make the call. The blinds fold, and the pot is now $29. The flop comes 7 of spades, 5 of diamonds, and 2 of clubs. Your opponent bets $20, which is a standard continuation bet size for this pot. You have an overpair to the board, and your hand is ahead of many of your opponent's possible holdings. Calling here is reasonable, as you are only committing a small portion of your stack, and your hand is likely still good. The pot is now $69. The turn brings the jack of clubs, which is an overcard to your pair. Your opponent bets $50, a large bet that puts real pressure on your stack. At this point, your hand is now a second pair to the board, and the presence of the jack makes it much more likely that your opponent has improved or is betting with a stronger hand. Despite this, you call the $50 bet. The pot is now $169, and you have committed a significant portion of your stack. On the river, your opponent bets $80. You decide to fold, and your opponent takes down the pot. In this hand, the pre-flop call was reasonable, and the flop call was defensible with an overpair to the board. The mistake was calling the large turn bet after an overcard appeared. Most opponents at these stakes are not betting the turn with hands worse than yours, and by calling you committed too many chips with a hand that was no longer strong. Folding on the turn would have saved you $50 and avoided a difficult river decision. The lesson from this example is clear. When you are unsure about your hand's strength on the turn, especially after facing a second large bet, folding is usually the best option. Uncertainty is a signal that your hand is not strong enough to continue against your opponent's likely range. In a typical 30 big blind pot, folding to a turn bet can save you 10 to 15 big blinds compared to calling and then facing another bet on the river. This is a significant savings over time, and it preserves your stack for better opportunities. In live $1, $3 games, many opponents will bet the turn with the top 40 to 60% of their value range, which means that your marginal hands are often behind. By making the disciplined fold on the turn when you are unsure, you avoid the danger zone of overcommitting with weak or marginal holdings. This approach keeps you out of trouble and allows you to focus your chips on situations where you have a clear advantage. Remember, it is not weak to fold when you are uncertain. It is a sign of discipline and good judgment. and it is one of the most important habits you can develop to succeed in low-stakes live cash games. If you find yourself hesitating on the turn, ask yourself if your hand is truly strong enough to continue. If the answer is not clear, folding is almost always the right choice. This simple rule will protect your stack and help you avoid the costly mistake of calling twice with marginal hands. Let yourself relax into this mindset, knowing that careful turn decisions are a key part of long-term success at the table. Chapter 14. Bluffing at 1-3. Bluffing in live $1, $3 no-limit hold'em games often leads to disappointment, because most players at these stakes are simply not willing to fold often enough. The reality is that the average opponent in these games arrives at the table with a mindset that values seeing showdowns and satisfying curiosity over making tough folds. This tendency has a direct impact on your results when you attempt to represent strength without actually holding it. When you play in these games, you will notice that many players call bets with hands that are not strong, and they do so consistently. Even when the board looks disconnected or unlikely to have hit their range, they will call with hands as weak as 8-3 offsuit, especially if they have already invested chips on earlier streets. This is not a rare occurrence. It is a pattern that repeats itself throughout the night, and it is one of the main reasons why bluffing is so rarely rewarded at these limits. The calling habits of $1, $3 players are shaped by a mix of psychology and experience. Many players at these stakes are not thinking about ranges or probabilities. Instead, they are motivated by the desire to see if their hand is good, to avoid being bluffed, or simply to enjoy the action. When you see a player call quickly pre-flop or post-flop, it is often with a mediocre hand, something like a small pair, a weak Broadway, or a suited connector. These hands are not strong, but the player is not ready to let them go. You will also notice that when a player takes a long time before checking, they are usually holding a weak hand and hoping you will check behind. They are not setting a trap with a monster. They are just reluctant to fold and want to get to showdown as cheaply as possible. This is why, in these games, you will see players call down with hands that have little chance of winning, simply because they do not want to fold and miss out on the possibility of catching a lucky card or catching a bluff. Bluffing becomes even less effective when you consider the types of boards that commonly appear in these games. Certain board textures are especially bad for bluffing against typical $1, $3 opponents. For example, when the board is paired or full of draws, such as Queen 10-6 or 9-10 Queen, these cards connect with the types of hands that players like to call with before the flop. If you try to bluff on these boards, you are likely to run into players who have paired up or picked up a draw and are not going anywhere. Even on boards that look scary or coordinated, like 9-10 Queen, players at these stakes will call with medium pairs, gut-shot straight draws, or even just two overcards. The presence of multiple draws, or possible combinations, makes them even more likely to call, not less. Multiway pots add another layer of difficulty for bluffing. When several players see the flop, it is almost certain that at least one of them has connected with the board in some way. Maybe someone has top pair, another has a straight draw, and a third has a weak pair. In these situations, bluffing becomes almost pointless, because you need everyone to fold, and that rarely happens. Even if you bet big, at least one player is likely to call you down with a hand that is not very strong, simply because they do not want to fold and give up their chance at the pot. This is especially true on boards that improve the typical calling ranges, low cards pairing or a straight completing on the river. Players will call with weak aces, bottom pairs, or even just a gut-shot draw that got there. Their willingness to call is not based on careful analysis. It is based on hope and the desire to see the next card. To see how these tendencies play out in practice, consider a hand played at a full table, with 100 big blinds effective stacks. The player in middle position opens the action with a standard raise, holding ace of clubs and queen of spades. The button, who is known to play a wide and aggressive range including Broadway cards, suited aces, suited connectors, small pairs, and even some offsuit Broadways, calls the raise. The blinds fold, and the pot is set for heads-up action. On the flop, the dealer spreads 8 of diamonds, 6 of clubs, and 2 of spades. The player in middle position makes a continuation bet, which is a reasonable play with 2 overcards and some backdoor possibilities. The button calls, and the pot grows. At this point, the player in middle position still has only 2 overcards, with no pair and no draw. The turn brings the 4 of clubs. The player in middle position bets again, but still has not improved. The button calls once more, showing no hesitation. The river is the 2 of diamonds, pairing the board. The player in middle position decides to make a sizable bet, attempting to represent a strong hand. The button calls again. At showdown, the button reveals 2 sevens, which is a medium pair that never improved beyond its original strength. The player in middle position is forced to show ace high, and the button wins the pot. Looking at this hand, it is clear that the river bluff was a costly mistake. The board was paired and low, which is exactly the kind of texture that encourages calls from players who have any pair at all. The button had already called 2 bets with a medium pair, showing a willingness to stick around. By the river, there was little chance that a bluff would succeed, yet the player in middle position still tried to push the opponent off the hand. This is a common error at $1, $3 tables, where players are simply not folding pairs, especially after calling on earlier streets. The better approach in these situations is to recognize when your opponent is unlikely to fold and to avoid burning money with unnecessary bluffs. Instead of focusing on bluffing, the most reliable way to win at $1, $3 is to value bet your strong hands and let your opponents make the mistakes. When you have top pair with a good kicker, you will often get called by worse hands, even in multi-way pots. For example, if you have ace high on an ace high flop, you can bet for value and expect to be called by hands as weak as 8-3 offsuit. Medium pairs on low disconnected boards also get paid off by weaker holdings, allowing you to build the pot without needing your opponent to fold. When you have a structural advantage, such as an overpair in position, you can bet confidently and expect to be called by worse pairs or top pairs with a weak kicker. Even when you check back a value hand on a blank river, you will often win at showdown against opponents who called pre-flop, and on the flop with hands that are not as strong as yours. The lesson is simple but powerful. In these games, your opponents are eager to call and reluctant to fold. Bluffing rarely works because the players you are trying to fool are not thinking about what you represent. They are thinking about their own hand and their own curiosity. By focusing on value betting and letting your opponents call with worse, you will find that your results improve and your sessions become more consistent. Bluffing may seem tempting, but at $1, $3, it is value betting that truly pays the bills. Let your opponents call you down, and let the cards speak for themselves. Chapter 15. Aggression works best before the flop. When you take the lead before the community cards are dealt, you shape the entire hand in your favor. By making a standard raise before the flop, you force players who might otherwise see the flop for free to make a decision. This act of raising does more than just build the pot. It narrows the field, reducing the number of opponents who can continue. In live $1, $2, and $1, $3 games, a typical pre-flop raise is around 3 to 4 times the big blind. When you choose a size at the higher end of this range, you make it more expensive for speculative hands to call, and this often results in fewer players seeing the flop. Fewer opponents mean fewer hands that can outdraw you, and this clarity is valuable. When you raise, you also define your own range. Other players will see you as representing stronger holdings, which gives you a natural advantage on later streets. The act of raising pre-flop is not just about the cards you hold, but about setting up a simpler, more manageable situation for yourself after the flop. The pot is now contested by fewer players, and the hands that continue are more likely to be those that fit a predictable pattern. This makes your decisions after the flop less ambiguous and more grounded in logic. When you raise before the flop, you are not just building a pot, you are building a plan for the rest of the hand. If you choose not to take the lead before the flop, the hand can quickly become complicated. When several players limp or call, the pot often becomes multiway. Each extra opponent in the hand reduces the chance that your cards will hold up by the river. In these situations, it becomes much harder to know what kinds of hands your opponents might have. Their ranges are wide and unpredictable, and this makes it difficult to choose the right bet size, or even to know when you are ahead. When you try to be aggressive after the flop in a pot with many players, your bets are less likely to succeed. For a bluff to work, every opponent must fold. The more players there are, the less likely this becomes. Even when you have a strong hand, it is harder to get value, because you do not know which opponents might have connected with the board. In limped pots, the uncertainty grows, and the risk of running into a hidden strong hand increases. The decisions you face become more stressful and less clear. You may find yourself guessing, rather than acting with confidence. This is why relying on post-flop aggression, instead of taking charge before the flop, often leads to tougher, more ambiguous situations. Choosing to be assertive early in the hand gives you the initiative, which is the betting lead. This initiative allows you to set the pace for the rest of the hand. When you raise before the flop, you often isolate to just one or two opponents. This makes it much easier to plan your actions on the flop, turn, and river. With fewer players in the pot, the math becomes simpler. You can more easily calculate your odds and make decisions based on clear information. When you have the betting lead, you can choose to make a continuation bet for thin value, or you can check to control the size of the pot if the situation calls for caution. Raising early also protects your hand from being outdrawn by speculative holdings. By making it expensive to call, you deny opponents the chance to see cheap flops with hands that could make strong draws. This protection of your equity means you do not have to navigate complex post-flop situations as often. The hand becomes more straightforward, and you are less likely to face difficult decisions against unpredictable ranges. Let's look at a hand that shows the value of early aggression. Imagine you are sitting with a full stack of 100 big blinds. The action folds to a player in middle position, who decides to limp. This player's range includes hands like Ace-Jack offsuit, Ace-10 suited, King-Queen offsuit, King-Queen suited, Queen-Jack suited, pocket nines and higher, and suited connectors down to 7-6 suited. You are on the cutoff with the Ace of Spades and Queen of Spades. Instead of limping behind, you raise to $15, which is 5 times the big blind. The players in the blinds fold, and the limper calls your raise. Now the pot is $33, and you are heads up with the player in middle position. The flop comes 7 of clubs, 2 of diamonds, and 9 of spades. Your opponent checks to you. You make a continuation bet of $20. After a short pause, your opponent folds. At this point, your hand is just ace high, but you have the initiative and a backdoor flush draw. The hand ends right there. There is no turn or river to play. You win the pot without having to show your cards. The key to this outcome is the decision you made before the flop. By raising, you isolated the limper and defined both your own range and your opponent's. Your continuation bet on the flop leverages the fold equity you created by representing a strong hand. The opponent, facing a bet on a dry board, cannot continue with most of their speculative hands. The hand is over, and you have won a meaningful pot with minimal risk. If you had chosen to limp behind instead of raising, the hand would likely have played out very differently. More players might have entered the pot, and the flop could have been contested by 3 or 4 opponents. In that scenario, your ace-queen suited would be much harder to play. You would not have the initiative, and your opponent's ranges would be wide and unpredictable. Any bet you made after the flop would have to get through several players, making it less likely to succeed. The decisions you faced would be more complex, and the risk of running into a hidden strong hand would be higher. By choosing aggression before the flop, you avoided all of these problems. The lesson is simple but powerful. In live low-stakes games, taking the lead before the flop gives you control and clarity. It narrows the field, defines the ranges, and sets up easier decisions for the rest of the hand. When you raise before the flop, you protect your hand, build the pot, when you have an advantage, and make it harder for opponents to outdraw you cheaply. The game becomes less about guessing and more about making logical, confident decisions. Early aggression is not just about winning pots. It is about making the game simpler and more manageable, one hand at a time. As you settle into the rhythm of live play, remember that the best time to be assertive is before the flop. This approach will serve you well, helping you avoid difficult spots and guiding you toward more consistent results. Chapter 16. Calling because you're curious. Making calls without a clear reason leads to steady losses in live $1, $2, and $1, $3 no-limit hold'em. When a player puts chips into the pot, just to see what an opponent has, those chips are often surrendered quietly, hand after hand. This urge to call, simply to satisfy curiosity, is a common leak at these stakes. Many players find themselves unable to fold, even when their hand is weak and the story told by the betting is strong. The desire to see the opponent's cards, to confirm a suspicion, or to avoid being bluffed, can override sound decision-making. In these moments, the call is not made because of a plan or a belief that the hand is best, but because of a need to know. This is especially true on the river, where the final bet is often met with a call from a player holding just one pair or even less, despite a sense that they are likely beaten. The pattern is familiar. A passive opponent, who rarely bets, suddenly puts in a large wager, and curiosity takes over. The chips go in, the cards are revealed, and the weaker hand is shown to be second best. Over time, these curiosity-driven calls add up, quietly eroding the stack. In live low-stakes games, curiosity calls are frequent. Players often call river bets, with hands that have little chance of winning, simply because they want to see what the opponent was betting with. Sometimes the urge comes from not being able to name any worse hands that the opponent could have, but still wanting to verify. Other times it is triggered by an opponent who has played passively all hand, only to suddenly bet big on the river. The temptation to call, just to see, is strong. It is easy to convince oneself that the opponent could be bluffing, even when the evidence points the other way. The truth is that most of these calls are not based on a plan or a clear understanding of the opponent's range. They are made out of curiosity, and the cost is rarely noticed in the moment. Each individual call may seem small, but together, they form a steady leak that can turn a winning session into a losing one. The hidden cost of these curiosity calls is significant. Each time a player calls a river bet with a losing hand, a portion of their stack is surrendered. In a typical $1, $3 session, folding instead of calling in these spots preserves chips that would otherwise be lost. Over the course of many hands, the cumulative effect is clear. Hand histories from live games show that repeated curiosity calls with hands like one pair on the river lead to consistent losses. The chips given away in these spots are not easily won back. The drain is quiet but steady, and it is often overlooked because the calls feel justified in the moment. The desire to see the opponent's cards, to confirm a suspicion, or to avoid being bluffed, can be powerful. But when there are no worse hands in the opponent's range, calling is simply giving away chips. Folding in these situations is not just about saving money in one hand, it is about protecting the stack over the long run. To see how this plays out in practice, consider a hand from a typical $1, $3 game. The stacks are 80 big blinds deep, and the action begins with the button, a player known for raising a wide range of hands. This opponent is aggressive and will open with many combinations, including suited aces, Broadway cards, suited connectors starting from 5-4 suited, all pocket pairs, and even some offsuit Broadways. The small blind folds, and the action is on the big blind, who holds 8 of clubs and 6 of spades. The button raises to $10, and the big blind calls the extra $7. The pot is now $21. The flop comes Queen of Diamonds, 5 of spades and 2 of clubs. The big blind checks, and the button bets $12. The big blind calls. At this point, the big blind has only high card, with no pair or draw. There is no plan for future streets, and the call is made without a clear reason. The pot is now $45. The turn is the 3 of hearts. Again, the big blind checks, and the button bets $25. The big blind calls once more, still holding only high card and no draw. The pot grows to $95. The river is the king of spades. The big blind checks, and the button bets $40. The big blind calls for a third time. The button reveals ace of clubs and queen of spades for top pair with the best kicker. The big blind's 8 of clubs and 6 of spades are no match, and the chips are pushed to the button. In this hand, the pre-flop call was already a mistake, as 8-6 offsuit is too weak to defend profitably against a standard button open, especially out of position. The flop call was also incorrect, with no pair, no draw, and no plan. The turn call compounded the error, and the river call was made purely out of curiosity, with no realistic chance of winning. Folding at any point would have preserved a significant portion of the stack. Instead, the chips were surrendered in a predictable fashion, one street at a time. The lesson from this hand is clear. Calling without a plan, just to see what the opponent has, is a costly mistake. Each call may feel harmless, but together, they add up to a steady loss. The player who folds in these spots, when no worse hands exist in the opponent's range, protects their stack and avoids unnecessary risk. Folding is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of discipline. Against passive opponents, who suddenly bet aggressively on later streets, folding is often the best choice. The chips saved by folding are just as valuable as the chips won in big pots. Over time, disciplined folding leads to better results and a healthier bankroll. It is important to recognize when a call is being made out of curiosity rather than for a clear reason. If there is no plan, no belief that the hand is ahead, and no worse hands in the opponent's range, folding is the correct play. This discipline is what separates winning players from those who struggle to break even. Not every hand needs to be played to the end. Sometimes the best decision is to let go and wait for a better spot. Noting hands that were folded in uncertain spots can help reinforce this habit. The chips saved by folding add up over time, quietly building a stronger foundation for long-term success at the table. By folding when there is no clear plan, players avoid the hidden cost of curiosity and keep their stacks healthy for the hands that matter most. Chapter 17. Playing hands because you're bored. Long stretches of inactivity at the table can quietly erode a player's discipline, leading to costly decisions that undermine long-term results. In live $1, $2, and $1, $3 no-limit hold'em games, the pace is naturally slow. Dealers move at a measured rhythm, and the social atmosphere often encourages conversation between hands. On average, only about 25 to 30 hands are dealt each hour. This means it is common to fold hand after hand, sometimes sitting for 10 or 15 minutes without playing a single pot. During these periods, the temptation to loosen up and play hands outside of your usual range can become strong. Many players, feeling restless or simply wanting to participate, start to justify entering pots with hands that would normally be easy folds. The urge to break the monotony can lead to decisions that are not based on sound strategy, but rather on a desire to feel involved. It is important to recognize that this temptation is a natural part of the live game environment. The slower pace does not change the mathematics of the game. The statistical edge comes from maintaining discipline and only entering pots with hands that have a clear advantage against the types of hands your opponents are likely to play. When you stick to your chosen ranges, you are not just waiting, you are actively preserving your edge. Each fold is a small, quiet victory, protecting your chips for moments when the odds are truly in your favor. When players give in to the urge to play simply because they are bored, the consequences can be subtle at first but add up over time. Playing hands that fall outside of your disciplined range, such as calling with King-Jack offsuit from early position, or defending the blinds with Queen-10 offsuit, often leads to negative expected value situations. These hands are frequently dominated by the stronger holdings that opponents choose to play from those positions. For example, when a player in early position raises, and you call on the button with 8-7 suited just to see a flop, you are often up against hands that have you beat before the community cards are even dealt. If the flop misses your hand, as it often will, you are left with little choice but to fold to further aggression, losing the chips you invested pre-flop. Even when you pick up a draw, the odds of realizing your equity are reduced in multiway pots, especially when the pot is already contested by players with stronger ranges. The problem is compounded when you play marginal hands from poor positions, as you are forced to act without the benefit of information, making post-flop decisions more difficult and expensive. Over time, these boredom-driven plays chip away at your stack, turning what could have been a break-even or profitable session into a losing one. The losses may not always be dramatic, but they are consistent and predictable for those who stray from disciplined hand selection. Consider a hand that illustrates the cost of letting boredom dictate your actions. The table is playing with effective stacks of 120 big blinds. The player in middle position, who is playing a standard range that includes hands like Ace-Jack offsuit, King-Queen suited, and pocket nines, is seated to your right. You are in the cutoff seat. After several uneventful orbits, the action folds to you. Feeling restless, you decide to raise to 3 big blinds holding 9 of spades and 7 of clubs. The button and both blinds fold, but the middle position player calls. The pot is now 7.5 big blinds. The flop comes out with the 2 of diamonds, Jack of clubs, and 8 of spades. Your opponent checks, and you make a continuation bet of 4 big blinds. The middle position player calls again, bringing the pot to 15.5 big blinds. On the turn, the 4 of hearts appears. Your opponent checks once more, and this time you check behind, recognizing that your hand has not improved and offers little chance of winning at showdown. The river brings the Queen of Hearts. Your opponent now leads out with a bet of 10 big blinds. With no pair, no draw, and no realistic path to victory, you fold your hand. The middle position player collects the pot. At each stage, the weakness of your starting hand was evident. 9-7 offsuit is not a hand that should be opened from the cutoff against attentive opponents, especially when the primary motivation is simply to break the monotony of folding. The continuation bet on the flop was unlikely to succeed against a range that includes many strong top pairs and draws. The turn check was correct, but by then the damage was already done. The most significant mistake was the pre-flop raise with a hand that rarely makes strong pairs and is easily dominated. By playing this hand, you risked chips in a spot where patience would have preserved your stack for a better opportunity. The lesson is clear. Waiting for strong hands is not a passive act, but an active and profitable discipline. Each time you fold a marginal holding, you are making a conscious choice to protect your chips and reserve your energy for situations where you have a real advantage. Over the long run, players who consistently wait for premium pairs or suited Broadway cards from late position see their patience rewarded. When you finally pick up a strong hand, such as ace-king offsuit on the button after folding for several orbits, you are able to isolate weaker players and build pots with a significant equity edge. The chips you did not lose by playing out of boredom are now available to capitalize on these high-value opportunities. Patience also allows you to observe your opponents, picking up on their tendencies and habits, which can be used to your advantage when you do enter a pot. The data is clear. Players who maintain tight standards and only enter pots with hands that perform well against typical calling ranges enjoy higher win rates over time. The discipline to wait is not simply about avoiding losses. It is about creating the conditions for consistent profit. Each fold is a step toward a more successful session, and each hand you decline to play out of boredom is a quiet investment in your long-term results. Letting patience guide your decisions transforms the slow pace of live poker from a source of frustration into a foundation for steady, reliable gains. Chapter 18. Trying to win every pot. Trying to force a win in every hand leads to situations where the odds and the structure of the game are not in your favor. When players let their need to win take over, they often find themselves in pots with hands that are not strong enough to justify the risk. This approach is driven by ego, not by sound strategy. It is common to see players in low-stakes games become attached to the idea of never backing down, especially after folding a few hands in a row. They might start playing hands like 7-6 suited or King 9 suited from early position, hoping to outplay their opponents after the flop. The problem is that these hands are often dominated by stronger holdings, and the math rarely supports aggressive action with them. When you raise or call with a hand that is not likely to be ahead, you are setting yourself up for difficult decisions on later streets. The urge to prove something at the table, to show you can win any pot, often leads to unnecessary confrontations. These confrontations are not just costly in chips, they also drain your focus and energy over the course of a session. The most successful players at $1, $2, and $1, $3 tables are not the ones who win the most pots, but the ones who choose their battles carefully and avoid getting tangled up with weak holdings. When you chase every small pot, you increase the number of times you are forced to make tough decisions with incomplete information. Many players believe that by staying active and contesting every hand, they can slowly build their stack. In reality, this approach leads to more mistakes and more situations where the math is not on your side. For example, when you call a raise with a hand that only has overcards and a backdoor draw, you are often relying on hitting a very specific run-out to win. The pot odds rarely justify these calls, and the cost of chasing adds up quickly. Thin value bets into multiple opponents on boards that do not favor your range can also be a trap. The bet size compared to the final pot often means you need to be right a very high percentage of the time, but with marginal hands, that is rarely the case. Overcommitting to small pots with hands that have only a few clean outs forces you into calls where the break-even equity is not supported by the math. Over time, these small mistakes accumulate and can turn a winning player into a losing one. The key is to recognize that not every pot is worth fighting for, and that folding is often the most profitable decision you can make. Let's look at a hand that shows how trying to win every pot can lead to unnecessary losses. Imagine a table where both players have 100 big blinds to start the hand. The action folds to the button, who is known to play a wide and aggressive range, including suited connectors, suited aces, small pairs, and many Broadway hands. The button raises to 3 big blinds. You are in the small blind, with Queen of Diamonds and 6 of Spades. The big blind folds. Calling here with Queen 6 offsuit is a mistake. This hand is weak and will often be dominated by the button's range. You are also out of position for the rest of the hand, which makes it even harder to realize your equity. Still, you call, and the pot is now 7 big blinds. The flop comes 5 of clubs, 6 of hearts, and 8 of spades. You check, and the button bets 4 big blinds. With middle pair and a weak kicker, you decide to call. The pot is now 15 big blinds. At this point, your hand is still not strong. You have a pair of sixes, but the kicker is poor, and there are many ways for your opponent to have a better pair or a strong draw. The turn is the 2 of clubs. You check again, and this time the button checks behind. The river is the 9 of spades. Now you decide to bet 8 big blinds, trying to take the pot away. The button calls and shows 8 of diamonds and 7 of diamonds for a pair of 8s, which is enough to win. In this hand, the main mistake was getting involved at all. The pre-flop call with Queen 6 offsuit from the small blind against a wide but stronger range is not justified. The flop call is also marginal, as you are often behind and have few ways to improve. The river bet is an attempt to win the pot, despite holding a weak hand, and it is called by a better pair. The stack depth did not justify the loose pre-flop call or the river bluff. Throughout the hand, the button's range was ahead, and your hand was never strong enough to warrant continued aggression. The cost of trying to win this pot was unnecessary, and folding pre-flop would have saved you chips and avoided a difficult situation. The lesson here is that the desire to win every pot can lead you into trouble. When you focus on chasing small pots or trying to outplay every opponent, you end up in more marginal spots where the math is not on your side. The cumulative cost of these mistakes is significant. Each time you call with a weak hand or make a thin value bet that gets called by a better hand, you are giving away chips that could have been preserved for better opportunities. Over the course of many sessions, these small leaks add up and can erase the profits from your best hands. The most effective way to succeed in low-stakes live cash games is to practice selective engagement. This means choosing to play aggressively only when the situation is clearly in your favor. When the call required exceeds the pot odds implied by your number of cleanouts, folding is the right decision. By preserving your stack for higher expected value spots, you maintain the ability to make larger, more profitable bets when you have a real advantage. Aggression should be reserved for times when your hand structure provides enough outs, such as strong draws or made hands that are likely to be ahead. This approach keeps your risk focused on situations where you have a clear edge. Disciplined folding is a skill that pays off over time. By letting go of marginal hands and avoiding unnecessary confrontations, you protect your stack and your mental energy. Players who consistently avoid these thin spots tend to have higher long-term win rates. They are not winning every pot, but they are winning the pots that matter. The goal is not to prove that you can win any hand, but to make decisions that are supported by the math and the structure of the game. When you focus on selective engagement, you give yourself the best chance to succeed in the long run. Letting go of the need to win every pot is a sign of real poker maturity, and it is one of the most important habits you can develop at the $1, $2, and $1, $3 tables. Chapter 19. What live players accidentally tell you. Small details in how people act at the table can influence your decisions and help you make better choices in low-stakes live games. When you pay attention to the way someone moves their chips, sits in their chair, or interacts with the pot, you can sometimes pick up on subtle clues about their comfort level and the strength of their hand. These signals are not always reliable, but over time they can add up to a clearer picture of what your opponents might be holding. In live $1, $2, and $1, $3 games, many players are not trained to hide their reactions, so these small behaviors can become valuable sources of information if you watch carefully and patiently. When a player acts with calm, measured movements, it often suggests they feel at ease with their situation. For example, someone who sits upright, keeps their posture steady, and moves their chips with slow, deliberate motions is often showing that they are comfortable with the hand they are playing. You might notice a player who quietly and smoothly places their chips into the pot, without any unnecessary noise or fidgeting. This kind of chip handling is often associated with confidence, especially when compared to someone who splashes chips or acts with sudden jerky motions. Another sign of comfort is when a player glances at your stack, or the stacks of others, after the community cards are dealt. This action can mean they are thinking ahead about how much to bet, or whether they are willing to commit more chips, which often lines up with a strong hand or a plan to play aggressively. These cues are not always perfect, but they are common enough in live games that you should take note when you see them, especially if they repeat over several hands. On the other hand, hesitation and uncertainty can be just as telling. When a player pauses noticeably before betting or calling, it is often a sign that they are not sure about their hand or the situation. You might see someone pick up their chips, hesitate, and then put them back down before finally making a decision. This kind of repeated hesitation is a classic sign of discomfort or doubt. Physical signs can also appear, such as trembling hands, a pulsing neck vein, or shallow, quick breaths. These are all signs of stress and can indicate that the player is nervous about the outcome. Another common behavior is rechecking hole cards, especially after the board changes or when facing a big bet. If a player looks at their cards again or spends a long time examining them, it often means they are unsure about the strength of their hand or are hoping to find a reason to call or fold. These behaviors are not guarantees, but they are widely observed in live games and can help you decide whether to apply pressure or back off. To see how these ideas play out in a real hand, imagine a situation at a $1, $2 table, with both players holding deep stacks, about 120 big blinds each. The player in middle position, opens the action with a standard raise, and it folds around to you on the button. You hold ace of spades and jack of spades, a suited Broadway hand that plays well in position with deep stacks. You call, and the blinds fold, leaving you heads up with the original raiser. The flop comes 8 of clubs, 4 of diamonds, and 2 of spades. The middle position player continues with a bet, and you call with 2 overcards and a backdoor flush draw. At this point your hand is not made, but you have potential to improve and position to see what develops. On the turn, the 7 of spades appears. Now the middle position player hesitates before checking. This pause is noticeable, and it stands out compared to their earlier, more confident actions. You decide to bet, putting out a modest wager that applies pressure. The middle position player calls after some thought. At this stage your hand has picked up a flush draw, giving you more outs, but you still do not have a made hand. The river brings the 3 of clubs. The middle position player quickly checks, and you check back, deciding not to risk a large bluff without a stronger read or a completed draw. The middle position player turns over Queen of spades and Queen of diamonds, winning the pot with an overpair to the board. In this hand, the hesitation on the turn was a live cue that suggested uncertainty, but it was not a guarantee of weakness. Your decision to bet the turn was sound, using the information available to apply pressure and possibly fold out weaker hands. However, you did not overcommit on the river, recognizing that a single cue is not enough to justify a large bluff. The middle position player's quick check on the river could have been a sign of strength or simply a desire to get to showdown. By treating these cues as probabilistic rather than certain, you avoided a costly mistake and played the hand well. The most important lesson is to focus on patterns rather than single moments. One instance of hesitation or confidence can be misleading, as players sometimes change their behavior from hand to hand or session to session. Instead of making snap judgments, try to observe how a player acts over several hands. If you notice that someone always acts quickly when they have a strong hand and hesitates when they are unsure, you can start to build a baseline for their behavior. Over time, these patterns become more reliable and can help you make better decisions. If you see a sudden change in how someone talks or sits, make a mental note, but do not rely on it until you see it happen again in a similar situation. In low-stakes live games, most players are not experts at hiding their reactions. By watching carefully and patiently, you can gather small pieces of information that add up over time. Remember that no single tell is ever certain, but consistent observation can give you an edge. The key is to remain calm, pay attention, and let the patterns reveal themselves as you play. This approach will help you make more informed decisions and avoid costly mistakes, especially when the pressure is on and the pots grow larger. Let yourself relax into the rhythm of the game, knowing that every hand is another chance to learn and observe. Chapter 20. Why slow playing costs you money. Letting opponents see extra cards without paying for them often leads to disappointing results, especially when you hold a very strong hand. When you check with a powerful holding in a heads-up pot, you give your opponent a free chance to improve. This is especially risky on boards that have possible draws or connected cards. Even if your opponent starts with a weaker hand, checking allows them to realize their potential and catch up. For example, if you have a strong hand like a set, and the board has suited or connected cards, checking gives your opponent the opportunity to make a straight or a flush without having to pay for the privilege. The risk is not just theoretical. In live $1, $2, and $1, $3 games, many players call with a wide range of hands before the flop. When you slow play, you allow these weaker hands to see more cards and possibly outdraw you. The difference in equity between your hand and your opponent's hand can shrink dramatically if you give away free cards. For instance, a player holding a suited connector might have only a small chance to win on the flop, but if you check, they get to see the turn for free, and their chances can increase sharply if the right card comes. This is how slow playing can turn a big favorite into a losing hand. The temptation to trap or disguise your strength is understandable, but in these games it is far more common for opponents to catch up than to pay you off later. Protecting your hand by betting is a simple way to prevent this from happening. Each time you check with a strong hand, you are inviting your opponent to improve, and over time this habit will cost you money. When you fail to build the pot with your best hands, you leave value on the table. In low-stakes live games, the pots are often not very large to begin with, so every opportunity to add chips matters. If you check with a strong hand, the pot remains small, and you miss out on bets that your opponent would have called. For example, if you have top pair with a strong kicker on a dry board, and you check, the pot will be much smaller than if you had made a standard bet and been called. Over many sessions, this difference adds up. The goal is to get as much value as possible when you are ahead, and that means putting chips in the pot when your hand is strong. Many players at these stakes will call with a wide range of hands, including weaker pairs and draws. By betting, you give them the chance to make a mistake by calling with worse hands. If you slow play, you miss this opportunity and allow the hand to stay small. Even if you end up winning, the amount you win is less than what you could have made by betting. The habit of checking strong hands in hopes of inducing action later often backfires, as opponents may not bet themselves or may improve to a hand that beats you. The most reliable way to maximize your winnings is to bet your strong hands right away and let your opponents make the decision to call or fold. This approach is especially effective in live $1, $3 games, where players are more likely to call than to bluff. To see how slow playing can cost you money, consider a hand played at a $1, $3 table with 100 big blinds effective stacks. The player in middle position opens the action with a raise to 12, holding 2 kings in their hand. The cutoff, who is known to play a wide and aggressive range including suited connectors, suited aces, and all pairs, calls the raise. The blinds fold, and the pot is now 29. On the flop, the board comes king of spades, 9 of clubs, and 4 of hearts. The player in middle position, holding top set, decides to check. The cutoff checks behind. At this point, the player in middle position has the strongest possible hand on the board, with 3 kings. By checking, they allow the cutoff to see the turn for free. The turn brings the 6 of spades. Now the player in middle position bets 15, and the cutoff calls. The pot grows to 59. On the river, the 10 of spades appears. The player in middle position bets 25, and the cutoff raises to 75. The player in middle position calls. The cutoff reveals 8 of spades and 7 of spades for a flush, winning the pot. The key moment in this hand is the flop check. By not betting the flop, the player in middle position allowed the cutoff to see a free card with a suited connector. This gave the cutoff the chance to pick up a flush draw on the turn and complete the flush on the river. If the player in middle position had bet the flop, the cutoff would have had to pay to continue, and might have folded or at least faced a much tougher decision. The slow play on the flop let the opponent realize their equity cheaply, and the result was a lost pot that could have been protected. This example shows how important it is to bet your strong hands right away. When you have a powerful holding, such as top set or an overpair, betting immediately serves 2 purposes. First, it protects your equity by charging opponents who want to draw. Second, it builds the pot so that you can win more when you are ahead. In live $1, $3 games, a pot-sized bet with a strong hand on the flop often gets called by a wide range of hands, including draws and weaker pairs. This is the best time to get value, because opponents are more likely to call with hands that are behind. If you wait and check, you give them a free chance to improve, and you miss out on value. The urge to slow play can be strong, especially when you want to keep opponents in the pot. But in these games, straightforward aggression is almost always rewarded. When you raise with your strong hands, you prevent opponents from seeing cheap cards, and you put pressure on their weaker holdings. This approach is simple and effective, and it leads to bigger pots when you are ahead, and fewer bad beats when opponents would have caught up for free. The lesson is clear. In low-stakes live games, slow playing strong hands in heads-up pots often leads to lost value and unnecessary risk. By betting and raising with your best hands, you protect your equity and build bigger pots. Over time, this approach will increase your winnings and reduce the frustration of being outdrawn. The next time you find yourself with a strong hand, remember that betting now is almost always better than waiting. Let your opponents pay to see more cards, and you will find that your results steadily improve. Chapter 21. When people don't bluff. Most players at the $1, $2, and $1, $3 tables rarely attempt large bluffs, especially when the pot has grown to a significant size. This tendency shapes the way hands play out and has a direct impact on your decision-making at the table. The discomfort many recreational players feel when risking a large portion of their stack leads to a strong preference for betting only when they believe they have the best hand. In these games, the fear of losing money often outweighs the potential reward of pulling off a successful bluff. When the pot is already sizable, and a player faces the prospect of putting in a large bet, the emotional weight of possibly losing a full buy-in or more becomes very real. Most players at these stakes are there to enjoy themselves, not to test the limits of their nerve with big risky moves. This risk aversion is especially pronounced after the flop, when pots can quickly balloon due to typical pre-flop raises of around $15 and multiple callers. The result is that large bluffs become rare, and most big bets you see, particularly on the river, are made with strong hands. The psychology behind this is straightforward. Recreational players at these stakes are motivated by the desire to avoid losses. They do not want to go home empty-handed, and the idea of losing a full stack on a failed bluff is deeply uncomfortable. This leads to a pattern where players bet smaller amounts when they are uncertain and reserve their larger bets for situations where they feel very confident. In addition, the presence of loose callers in these games makes bluffing even less attractive. Many players have experienced the frustration of making a big bluff, only to be called down by someone with a marginal hand. This memory lingers, reinforcing the idea that big bluffs are simply not worth the risk. As a result, most players stick to straightforward value betting and avoid putting themselves in situations where they could lose a lot of chips without a strong hand. There are certain situations at these stakes where a large bet almost always means a strong hand. One of the most common is the big river bet, especially when it comes after a sequence of bets on previous streets. When a player who raised pre-flop continues to bet on the flop and turn, then makes a large bet on the river, this pattern is overwhelmingly associated with value hands. The reason is that most players at $1, $3 are not comfortable risking a large sum as a bluff after investing so much already. Over bets or pot-sized bets on dry river boards are another clear signal. In these games, players rarely try to represent missed draws with big bets. Instead, They use these large sizes to extract value from opponents they believe will call with worse hands. The pattern is consistent. Big bets, especially on the river, are made with strong hands far more often than with bluffs. Let's look at a hand that illustrates this tendency. Both players begin with stacks of about 120 big blinds, which is a typical effective stack at these tables. The action starts with a player in middle position, who opens the betting with a raise to $12. This is a standard open size for the game, and signals a reasonable range of hands, including strong aces, Broadway cards, suited connectors, and pocket pairs. The action folds around to the button, who decides to call. The blinds fold, and the hand goes heads up to the flop, with a pot of $29. On the flop, the board comes 8 of spades, 4 of diamonds, and 2 of clubs. The pre-flop raiser continues with a bet of $20. The button calls. At this point, the button holds 2 overcards to the board and a backdoor nut flush draw. This is a reasonable call, as there are many turn cards that can improve the button's hand, and the bet size is not overly large relative to the pot. The turn brings the 7 of clubs. The pre-flop raiser bets $45, and the button calls again. Now the button has picked up the nut flush draw, in addition to the 2 overcards. With the pot growing, and the potential to make the best possible flush, calling is justified. The pot is now $159. The river is the queen of hearts. The pre-flop raiser now bets $120 into the pot. This is a large bet, nearly the size of the pot, and it comes after 3 consecutive bets on each street. The button faces a difficult decision. The nut flush draw has missed, and the only possible showdown value is with ace high. In this spot, the button chooses to fold. The pre-flop raiser wins the pot without a showdown. After the hand, it is revealed that the pre-flop raiser held pocket queens, giving them a strong overpair on the flop and a set on the river. The button's disciplined fold saved a significant amount of money. This hand is a clear example of how large river bets in these games almost always represent strong value hands. The action sequence pre-flop, raise, flop, bet, turn bet, and a big river bet fits the pattern of a player betting for value with a strong hand. In these situations, calling with missed draws or weak hands is rarely rewarded, because the vast majority of players at these stakes are not bluffing in this spot. The lesson here is to trust the evidence when the story points to strength. When you face a large bet on the river after a consistent pattern of aggression, especially from a player who raised pre-flop and continued betting, it is usually correct to fold unless you have a very strong hand yourself. Emotional discipline is key. It is natural to feel curious or to want to catch a bluff, but in these games, the big river bet is almost always the real thing. Folding in these spots protects your stack and keeps you from making costly mistakes. Over time, you will find that letting go of marginal hands in the face of overwhelming evidence is one of the most important skills for long-term success at these stakes. Remember that the goal is not to win every pot, but to make the best decisions with the information available. When the action and bet sizing tell a clear story of strength, folding is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of understanding how these games are played and respecting the tendencies of your opponents. By consistently making disciplined folds in value-heavy spots, you avoid the trap of hero calling against players who rarely bluff big. This approach will help you keep your losses small and your results steady, allowing you to focus on the spots where your opponents do make mistakes. In the long run, patience and discipline in these situations will serve you well at the $1, $2, and $1, $3 tables. Chapter 22. Quit when you're tired or up. Making the choice to leave a poker table before exhaustion sets in is a skill that protects your winnings and your decision-making. When you play for long stretches, your mind gradually loses its sharpness. The longer you sit, the more your focus and patience start to slip away, even if you do not notice it at first. In low-stakes live games, where every decision can be the difference between a small win and a frustrating loss, this slow drain on your mental energy matters. As you grow tired, your brain shifts from careful analysis to making quick, less thoughtful choices. You may find yourself calling with hands you would normally fold, or missing value bets that you would have seen earlier in the session. Fatigue does not always announce itself with yawns or heavy eyelids. Sometimes it shows up as a string of snap decisions, or a feeling that you are just going through the motions. This is what players call autopiloting, and it is a common trap in long sessions. When you are tired, you might check when you should bet, or call when you should fold, simply because it feels easier than thinking through the hand. Over time, these small mistakes add up. Studies of poker players show that sleep deprivation and decision fatigue lead to more emotional reactions and less accurate reads of the table. Even if you start the session with strong discipline, tiredness can quietly erode your technical accuracy. The best players recognize this subtle shift and choose to leave before their play declines. By quitting when you notice your focus fading, you avoid the costly errors that come from mental exhaustion. There is another, quieter danger that comes from being ahead in a session. When you are up, it is easy to feel invincible. The chips in front of you can create a sense of overconfidence, making you believe that every hand will go your way. This feeling is sometimes called winner's tilt. It is not the same as the frustration that comes from losing, but it can be just as dangerous. When you are winning, you might start to play more hands than usual, or take risks that you would not consider if you were even or behind. You may loosen your starting hand requirements, or call down aggressive opponents with weaker holdings, simply because you feel protected by your earlier gains. Overconfidence can lead to structural mistakes, like ignoring your opponent's tendencies, or failing to adjust your ranges. Instead of making careful, calculated decisions, you might find yourself reacting to the action, chasing even bigger wins. This is how players often give back their profits. The discipline that helped you build your stack can slip away, replaced by impatience and a desire to keep the run going. In live $1, $2, and $1, $3 games, this pattern is common. Many players who start the night with a strong lead end up leaving with much less, or even losing, because they could not step away when they were ahead. Recognizing the subtle shift from disciplined play to overconfident decisions is a key part of protecting your winnings. One of the most effective habits you can develop is planning your exit before you sit down. By setting clear criteria for when to leave, such as a certain session length, or reaching a specific stack size, you give yourself a structure that helps you avoid fatigue-induced mistakes. For example, you might decide to leave after 4 hours of play, or when your stack reaches 200 big blinds. These planned exits are not about limiting your potential, but about preserving your decision quality and locking in profits. When you quit intentionally after a big win, especially with hands like suited broadways against wide ranges, you reinforce the habit of prioritizing long-term success over short-term excitement. It is not always easy to leave when you are tired or up, but doing so is a sign of discipline and self-awareness. The players who consistently protect their profits are the ones who recognize when their focus is slipping, or when their recent wins are starting to influence their decisions. By sticking to your exit plan, you avoid the temptation to force marginal spots or chase even bigger gains when your edge is fading. Let's look at a hand that shows this discipline in action. In a deep-stacked live game, Both players have about 150 big blinds. The cutoff, who is known for playing a wide and aggressive range, opens the action. This player is capable of raising with Broadway cards, suited aces, suited connectors starting from 5-4 suited, small pairs, and even some offsuit Broadways. The action folds around to the big blind, who calls. At this point, the pot is $22. The big blind holds the king of spades and queen of spades, a strong and versatile hand against a wide opening range, and with deep stacks. The flop comes 9 of clubs, 7 of spades, and 2 of diamonds. The big blind checks, and the cutoff continues with a bet of $15. Facing this bet, the big blind folds. At this moment, the big blind has completely missed the board, holding only 2 overcards with no straight or flush draw. Folding is the correct decision against an aggressive opponent on this dry flop. What matters most here is not just the technical play, but the awareness that comes after the hand. The big blind recognizes that after a long session and a significant win, fatigue is starting to set in. Rather than continue playing and risk making mistakes, the player chooses to leave the table. This decision preserves the winnings from the session and avoids the errors that often come from tiredness or the urge to chase even more profit. The real success in this hand is not in the cards but in the discipline to quit while ahead and tired, rather than forcing marginal situations. Leaving the table when you are tired, or after a big win, is not a sign of weakness. It is a proactive skill that separates steady winners from those who struggle to hold on to their gains. By recognizing the signs of fatigue and the subtle effects of being ahead, you give yourself the best chance to make clear, accurate decisions every time you play. Setting planned exits and sticking to them helps you avoid the pitfalls of autopiloting and overconfidence. In the long run, this habit will protect your profits and keep your game sharp, session after session. The next time you feel your focus slipping, or notice that your recent wins are changing your decisions, remember that the smartest move may be to stand up and leave, locking in your success for another day. Chapter 23. One bad hand shouldn't change your night. Losing a single hand, even when holding a very strong combination, does not reflect a mistake or a personal shortcoming at the poker table. In live $1, $2, and $1, $3 games, it is entirely normal for even the best starting hands to lose from time to time. This is simply a result of how the cards fall and the way the game is structured. For example, when you are dealt pocket aces and the board comes out with cards like 7, 8, and 9, especially if 2 of them are the same suit, your advantage can shrink quickly, especially against several opponents who call with hands that can make straights or flushes. Even when you are a large favorite before the flop, the reality is that the deck can produce combinations that allow your opponents to catch up. Sometimes you will be in a situation where you are a huge favorite, needing only to fade 2 specific cards on the turn and river, and still lose. These rare but memorable moments are part of the natural rhythm of live poker. They are not a reflection of your skill or your decision-making. In fact, the presence of players who call with speculative hands like Jack-10 suited or 9-6 suited is exactly what makes these games profitable in the long run. Over time, your strong hands will win more often than they lose, but the losses are inevitable and should be expected. When you see a strong hand beaten by a less likely combination, it is simply the game playing out as it always has, not a sign that you have failed or that you should change your approach. After a tough loss, it is common to feel a strong urge to get those chips back right away. This feeling can lead to decisions that are much more damaging than the original hand. When players react to a setback by betting larger than usual, they often find themselves losing even more, especially when opponents have medium-strength hands that are happy to call down. For example, after losing a big pot, you might find yourself calling raises with hands you would normally fold, hoping to catch a lucky card or to force a win. These looser calls reduce your chances of winning the pot and increase the amount you risk unnecessarily. Another common mistake is to make oversized bets on the turn or river, especially on boards that have become dangerous with possible straights or flushes. When you commit a large portion of your stack in these situations, you are often up against players who have already made their hands. The damage from chasing losses can quickly add up, turning a single unlucky hand into a much larger setback. The key is to recognize that the urge to recover quickly is natural, but acting on it by playing more aggressively or more loosely than usual almost always leads to greater losses. The best way to protect your stack is to avoid letting one hand dictate your decisions for the rest of the session. Let's look at a hand that shows how chasing losses can compound the problem. Imagine you are sitting with a stack of 120 big blinds, and you are in the cutoff seat. The player in middle position opens the betting to $12. This player has a typical range for this spot, including hands like ace-jack offsuit, king-queen suited, pocket nines, and suited connectors such as 7-6 suited. You look down at two queens, the queen of spades and the queen of hearts. This is a strong hand, and you correctly raise to $35. The action folds back to the original raiser, who calls. The pot is now $74. On the flop, the dealer spreads the 7 of clubs, 8 of spades, and 2 of diamonds. The middle position player checks, and you make a standard bet of $45 for value and protection. Your opponent calls, and the pot grows to $164. At this point, you still have an overpair to the board, which is a strong made hand, but the board is starting to show some possible straight draws. The turn brings the 9 of clubs. Again, your opponent checks. You decide to bet $90, a large bet given the coordinated nature of the board. Your opponent calls, and the pot is now $344. Now your overpair is facing a board with 4 connected cards, increasing the likelihood that your opponent could have made a straight. On the river, the 10 of spades appears. Your opponent checks once more. At this moment, the board is very dangerous, with several possible straights completed. Instead of checking or making a smaller, more cautious bet, you push all in for your remaining $250. Your opponent calls quickly and turns over jack of spades and 6 of spades for a straight. You lose the hand. The key mistake here is not in the preflop or flop play, which were both standard. The problem began with the large turn bet on a coordinated board and was made worse by the river shove. This decision was likely influenced by frustration from the way the board developed, leading to an emotional commitment of your entire stack in a spot where your opponent's range included many hands that had you beat. If you had checked the river or even folded, the loss would have been much smaller. Instead, the desire to recover from the earlier setback led to a much larger loss. The most effective way to regain control after a difficult hand is to return to the basics that have served you well. This means sticking to your usual hand selection and bet sizing guidelines, regardless of what just happened. When you are dealt a premium pair like queens in position against a loose opener, continue to make your standard 3-bet. On the flop, if the board is dry and uncoordinated, a value bet for protection is appropriate. However, when the board becomes more connected with cards that can complete draws, it is important to adjust your bet sizing. Smaller bets or even checks on the turn can help you maintain your stack depth and avoid overcommitting when the situation is uncertain. On the river, if the board is especially dangerous and your opponent's range includes many hands that can beat you, checking or folding is often the best way to minimize losses. By following these disciplined steps, you prevent one bad hand from turning into a losing session. The goal is not to win every pot, but to make the best possible decisions with the information you have. When you focus on fundamentals and avoid letting emotions dictate your actions, you give yourself the best chance to recover and play your best poker for the rest of the night. Even after a setback, returning to simple, disciplined decisions will protect your stack and help you make the most of every opportunity that comes your way. Chapter 24: Letting the game come to you. Making steady, thoughtful choices at the table leads to fewer costly mistakes and more consistent results. When you fold hands that are not likely to win, you protect your stack and avoid difficult situations. Betting with your strongest holdings, especially when facing just one opponent, puts pressure on weaker ranges and helps you claim pots without unnecessary risk. Steering clear of marginal situations means you are not forced into tough decisions on later streets where guessing can become expensive. These habits, folding early, betting strong, and avoiding the gray areas, form the backbone of a calm, reliable approach to low-stakes live no-limit hold'em. By following these rules, you give yourself the best chance to let the game come to you, rather than chasing after every possible opportunity. Consider a hand played at a full table, with 100 big blinds effective between the under-the-gun seat and the button. The player in the first position holds the ace of spades and queen of spades. This is a premium starting hand for early position, well within the recommended opening range. The action begins with the under-the-gun player, raising to $12. All players fold until the button, who calls. The button's range here is wide and aggressive, including suited aces, Broadway cards, suited connectors, starting from 5-4 suited, all pocket pairs, and some offsuit Broadways. The blinds fold, and the pot stands at $27. The flop comes 5 of clubs, 7 of spades, and king of diamonds. The under-the-gun player is first to act, and chooses to check. This is a dry board with only one overcard to the ace-queen and no flush or straight draws for the under-the-gun player. Checking here is a disciplined, conservative line, especially out of position against a wide button range. The button bets $15. Facing this bet, the under-the-gun player folds. At this moment, the only holding is ace-high, with no meaningful draw and little chance to improve. Folding avoids a marginal spot where calling would likely lead to more difficult decisions on later streets. The button collects the pot. This hand demonstrates the value of folding early when you do not connect with the board and are out of position against a wide range. The disciplined choice to let go of ace-high, rather than chasing or calling down, preserves chips and keeps you out of trouble. This is a clear example of letting the game come to you by waiting for better opportunities. Keeping your decisions simple and repeatable brings a sense of calm to your sessions. When you stick to a straightforward plan, raising with your best hands, folding the rest, and betting for value when you connect, you reduce the number of complicated situations you face. This approach limits the size of pots you play and keeps your variance lower, which means your results will swing less from session to session. By choosing clear, direct actions, you avoid the stress of multi-street bluffs or tricky river calls that can drain your mental energy. Each hand becomes easier to play, and you save your focus for the moments that matter most. Over time, this simplicity helps you maintain a steady mindset and avoid the fatigue that comes from overthinking every decision. Imagine a session where you consistently fold weak hands before the flop and only continue with strong holdings. You find yourself in fewer large pots, and the decisions you face are more straightforward. When you do bet, It is with confidence, knowing your hand is likely ahead. This style of play means you spend less time agonizing over marginal spots and more time watching the table, picking up information, and staying relaxed. The session feels less stressful, and your results are less volatile. By keeping your choices simple, you make the game easier on yourself and allow your best habits to shine through. Repeating these core habits, folding early, betting strong, and avoiding marginal spots, builds a foundation for long-term improvement. The more you practice these decisions, the more natural they become. Each time you let go of a weak hand or value bet a strong one, you reinforce the patterns that lead to success. Over time, these habits settle in, and you find yourself making the right choices without hesitation. Taking time to rest after your sessions is just as important. When you step away from the table and allow your mind to relax, you give your brain a chance to process and store the lessons you have learned. Rest helps your memory and makes it easier to recall the right moves the next time you play. Many players who have improved at low-stakes live games have done so by repeating these simple habits and giving themselves time to absorb the lessons. They do not rush the process or try to force results. Instead, they focus on making good decisions, one hand at a time, and trust that steady practice will bring improvement. By folding under pairs before the flop and betting top pair for value, they avoid the traps that catch less disciplined players. With each session, their confidence grows and the game feels less overwhelming. Letting the game come to you is about patience and trust in your process. You do not need to chase every pot or force action when the cards are not in your favor. By folding early, betting strong, and avoiding marginal spots, you give yourself the best chance to succeed over time. Keeping your decisions simple calms the game and makes each session more enjoyable. With steady repetition and plenty of rest, these lessons will settle in, and you will find yourself playing with more confidence and ease. Allow yourself to relax, knowing that each good decision brings you closer to your goals. The game will be there when you are ready, and your calm, disciplined approach will serve you well.